Last time I graded the overall performance of the 18 Space Marine Legions across the Horus Hersey. Some, like the Iron Warriors or the Imperial Fists, came out looking like straight up MVPs of the entire Heresy, while others, well, like the Emperor's Children or the Salamanders, let's just say the scoreboard was not kind to them. But that is only half of the story, because Space Marine Legions don't make all of the decisions, their Primarchs do. And when you actually start looking at these supposedly genius demigods' choices during the Heresy, things start getting a lot more questionable. So due to popular demand, we're moving on to the Primarchs themselves. However though, there is no way in hell I can fit all 18 of these degen space babies into a single video. And trust me guys, I tried. So in today's video, we're focusing exclusively on the Loyalist Primarchs. The Primarchs who stayed loyal to the Emperor of Mankind and didn't betray their race to the ruinous Pantheon. Then in the next video, we'll turn our attention to the traitor Primarchs and see which of Horus's brothers were masterminds and which ones were complete disasters. Just like before, each Primarch will receive a grade from S for Space Baby Superstar all the way down to F for fraud. Who saved the Imperium? Who nearly doomed humanity through their bad choices? And which Primarch deserves to be permanently put on fraud watch? Well heard, let's find out by diving straight into the cow hole. It's time to hand out the grades. Before we get into the Primarchs, we need to first establish how this grading system works. Because unlike the Legion video, this time we're not just looking at performance, we're also grading decision making. So this grade list is factoring in everything the Primarchs did throughout the Heresy, including their decisions, their victories, their defeats, and of course, how many Kit Kats they could eat in one sitting.
I don't think the system works.
Well, maybe not that, since we all know Mortarion, the fat chud, could probably eat the most. But we'll be grading them on the rest of that criteria throughout the extent of the Horus Heresy. Now, I won't be factoring in Legion performance in this video, because otherwise it would be literally the last video all over again. And yes, since somehow I got these comments in the last video, I'm still a completely impartial, totally unbiased, scientifically verified democratic cow doing my civic duty of analyzing transhuman war crimes. If you disagree with any of my rankings, let me know down in the comments. Now, with that out of the way, let's lock in the grading system. We're working with a simple scale: S, A, B, C, D, and F, which stands for fraud. Let's go through them one by one, starting at the very top with the S grade. S grade is where we find the Primarchs who made peak decision making and were instrumental throughout the Horus Heresy. Every major move they made mattered, and most of them were the reason their side even had a chance in the first place. After that comes the A grade. The degens found here are still elite performers. They are extremely strong leaders and made impactful decisions throughout the Horus Heresy, but they're just missing that undeniable main character of the galaxy dominance, and so receive an A grade. After that is the B grade. These Primarchs are overall solid. They generally made good calls and held their own weight, even though they didn't have the biggest impact on the Horus Heresy. C grade is where we find the Primarchs who are just mid or inconsistent. They were occasionally solid throughout the war, but overall they're lacking in either impact or smart decision making when it mattered the most. Second to last is the D grade. Here we find Primarchs who just struggle. They spend most of the Heresy making questionable calls, losing control of situations, or actively making things worse for their own side. And finally, at the very bottom of my grading system is the F grade for fraud. These Primarchs are complete disasters. They either made horrible decisions or actively accelerated the downfall of everything they were meant to protect. Once a Primarch is graded, they'll be placed directly into the grading system on screen. And at the very end of the video, I'm going to crown the MVP of the Loyalist side. The Primarch who I think genuinely stood above the rest of his brothers. But with all that said, let's begin, starting with the First Legion's Primarch, everyone's favorite Lionel Johnson. First off, Lionel Johnson is of course the Lord of the First Legion, and so commands one of the most feared and powerful legions of the Adeptus Astartes. The Dark Angels were both large in number and also equipped with some of the most advanced relics from the Dark Age of technology, including cyclonic torpedoes and actual AI units like the Excendio. But before we actually get into what Lionel Johnson did during the Horus Heresy, it's first important to establish what he's consistently portrayed as in canon, because on paper, he is one of the most brilliant tacticians in the entire setting, as Horus Heresy Book 9 Crusade points out. Johnson was a brilliant commander. In many ways, that made him a superior battlefield commander to those amongst his brothers, such as Leman or Dorn, whose supernatural abilities caused them to plan to excess where action was demanded. There were times, though, when lesser men were made to suffer for it. Once he was boxed into a corner, pride would not let him back down. He would fight any battle, once it had been joined, however misguided. The Lion thrives when things are already in motion, essentially when the battle is already joined. He reacts, adjusts, and wins fights in real time. That makes him arguably more effective in battle, even if sometimes that comes at a high cost. This excerpt also touches on his pride, which is a major factor in his decision making and overall performance throughout the Heresy, because sometimes his pride is his undoing. Little bit of a spoiler, but don't forget that piece of information. Wink, wink. Even Leman himself, the builder of empires, places the Lion in extremely rare company. As seen in the book Unremembered Empire, he states that there were only two brothers he ever truly looked up to, Lionel Johnson and Horus Lubercal, the only two Primarchs he genuinely respected and felt overshadowed by. And Leman doesn't really hand out respect easily. And for him to rank the Lion alongside Horus Lubercal does suggest that, at least in terms of command and strategic genius, that the Lion is absolutely one of the best commanders amongst his brothers. And the glaze does not stop there, people, come on now. Even Horus himself, the War Master, treats the Lion as a legitimate threat throughout the Heresy. While he stole the Emperor's throne, and now it seemed that one man that Horus did not want to face had returned. The Lion had entered the war, and worse yet, the stoic Lord of Caliban had been driven to anger by the actions of his brother. So across multiple sources, the Lion is consistently described as a top-tier battlefield general, putting him arguably top 3 among all of his brothers, at least in terms of tactical command. And that's before even factoring in his combat ability, which, as you all may know, is also top tier. Now, that definitely sounds like I'm agenda pushing, but at a certain point, it's just what the lore supports, people. I could bring up every single statement I have and feed I have for the Lionel Johnson agenda, but you could also just watch this video here. Because oh boy, oh man, there are a lot of feats and statements that the Lion truly is one bad man.
Hello?
I love you.
So with that level of skill and reputation established, did the Lion actually live up to those statements during the Horus Heresy, or did even one of the Imperium's most complete warlords start to crack under pressure? Well, let's find out. And to be honest, it doesn't really start exactly great for the Boy Wonder from Caliban. When the Horus Heresy broke out, Lionel Johnson was campaigning far from Terra in the Shield Worlds. Instead of rushing blindly towards the Throne World, he decided to attack the Forge World of Diamat to secure powerful siege weapons that Horus would need to assail Terra. There on that planet, he would face the Dark Mechanicum, and the Lion would succeed and capture these weapons. But this early masterstroke immediately turned into one of his misplays. After securing said weapons, he immediately handed them over to Mr. Perturabo. Yes, the Lord of Iron, one of the traitor Primarchs. And you're probably wondering, wait Cal, that's one of the traitor Primarchs. Yes people, yes, you are right. The Lion exchanged them for political backing to become the next War Master, completely unaware that Perturabo was already aligned with Horus and had betrayed the Emperor. So while the other Primarchs in the early stages of the Horus Heresy were either massacring their kin at Esteban V, or were completely unaware of what was going on, the Lion was campaigning to become the next War Master. Way to go, buddy.
Total control. Bing, bing, bong, bong, bing, bing, bing. You know.
And it gets even worse when those same weapons were used against the Loyalists at Esteban V, as seen in the book Son of the Forest. The Lion is bitterly aware that he has not always been the best judge of character. On Diamat, he handed siege machines over to Perturabo, in the mistaken belief that his brother was going to use them to crush Horus's nascent rebellion. Instead, those guns spelled doom for the Raven Guard and Salamanders at Esteban V. And later we know they were used at the Siege of Terra to test the Aegis shield. So, not exactly a great start for the Caliban Boy Wonder. But it's not like the Lion knew Purdy was already sworn to Horus. But still, I have to count it against him, since it positively aided the traitors throughout the war. From there, the Lion became tied up in the Muisc Crusade, where he fought Conrad Kurz and the Night Lords across the Eastern Fringe. Now, this campaign is huge for evaluating the Lion, because it perfectly shows both his strengths and his biggest flaws. When the Lion first entered the war, he hit the Night Lords hard, launching a brutal counteroffensive at Tripolex, completely dismantling the traitor fleet, reclaiming key Forge worlds, and personally leading the campaign from the front. This is peak Lion. He's decisive, aggressive, and incredibly deadly on the battlefield. Like seriously, whenever he's actually on the battlefield, things tend to go very, very well for the First Legion. And that trend continues throughout the campaign. He's constantly at the forefront, and at one point, he even faces the Witch of Thramis, a massive, nightmarish construct that not even his own dreadnoughts could bring down. And the Lion just steps in and kills it himself. What a badass. So in terms of combat ability, he absolutely lives up to the hype. But I assume you already knew that. But here's where the problems start. Since the Night Lords don't really fight like a normal legion, they rely on terror tactics and hit-and-run warfare instead of fighting in a straight-up manner. This results in the Lion committing harder and harder to this campaign, sinking more and more resources to finishing off Conrad Kurz and his legion. Which should have been a relatively contained operation, turns into a drawn-out war of attrition that drags on far longer than it realistically should have. And a big part of that is the Lion himself. His growing obsession with hunting curs turns the entire campaign into a personal vendetta. Instead of focusing purely on the wider strategic picture, he locks in on destroying one legion and one Primarch, even as the larger Horus Heresy is escalating elsewhere. So while he is winning tactically, he's arguably losing strategically by keeping one of the Imperium's strongest legions tied up in the Eastern Fringe instead of reinforcing more critical fronts like Terra. That being said though, he does eventually pull off one of the most impressive plays of the entire campaign. At the climax of the Muisc Crusade, the Lion orchestrates a massive ambush using the T'Challa device. This catches the entire Night Lord Legion completely off guard. The result is devastating for the traitors. Their fleet is shattered, their legion is crippled, and Kurz himself is defeated. From a purely tactical standpoint, it's a masterclass. But even there, it's not exactly perfect. Kurz escapes, the Night Lords aren't fully destroyed, and by the end of the campaign, the entire sector is left in ruins after years of brutal fighting. So while the Lion and the Dark Angels do win the Muisc Crusade, it comes at a massive cost of time, resources, and missed opportunities elsewhere in the war. Just to truly show what the Lion missed, the Muisc Crusade was fought from 007 M31 to 009 M31, so 3 Terran years. And during this time period, the Battle of Kalthakerd, the Shadow Crusade ripped through the 500 worlds, the Ruin Storm was unleashed, the White Scars made their choice, Mars was taken over by the Dark Mechanicum, and the traitor forces pushed forward on Terra. Most of all, they also missed the Dropsite Massacre. So truthfully, the Dark Angels and the Lion missed a whole lot, and they could have made a difference at any one of these battlefronts if they had been there. During this time, the Lion also reinstated the Librarians in defiance of the Council of Nicaea, which I will say was the right decision, but in doing so, he even killed one of his own, Nemiol during an internal dispute, where Nemiol was literally bitch slapped so hard his head went flying off. This is a common theme throughout the Horus Heresy, where the lion gets very emotional and acts recklessly, causing several bad decisions that almost always come to bite him in the ass. Eventually, the Ruin Storm forces the lion to McQueen, where he joins Guilliman and Sanguinius in forming Imperium Secundus. There he is named Lord Protector, second only to Sanguinius. However, his time in this role is marked by increasing tension with Guilliman, extreme measures like enforcing martial law, and a willingness to consider destroying parts of Ultramar just to flush out Kurz, who, mind you, the lion brought to McQueen on accident without telling Guilliman. Wow, great idea, lion, great idea. Which is another issue with the lion throughout the Heresy. The man is too secretive for his own good. The lion even feels guilty about this 10,000 years later, as seen in the book Son of the Forest. How much grief and bloodshed could have been spared had he been able to trust Guilliman from the moment the Dark Angels arrived through the Ruin Storm at McQueen. Instead, both of them kept their secrets with disastrous consequences. And due to these actions, Sanguinius even banishes the lion from Imperium Secundus, as seen in the book Angels of Caliban. He turned, thinking to take back his weapon, but was frozen by the look of cold rage in Guilliman's eyes. Jaw twitching, the Primarch of the Ultramarines took the lion's blade in both hands and brought it down sharply across his knee. The lion watched the blade split along the fuller, breaking into two shards that glittered in artificial sunlight. As they toppled from Guilliman's spreading fingers, they fell into the white sand at the lion's feet. "Your sword for your oath," Guilliman growled, teeth gritted. "Such has become your honor, Knight of Caliban." "Be gone," he heard Sanguinius say, not turning around. Immediately, the lion regretted his words, remembering the vision that had beset his lord of late. He took a step, but was stopped by the Emperor's next words. "Leave, brother. The triumvirate has ended. You are not welcome in Imperium Secundus." The lion thought to argue again, but there was no more to be said. He stalked from the Legata Colgaius without a backwards look. So, the lion, due to his actions, is banished from Guilliman and Sanguinius' realm. Now, I will say, he did ultimately defeat and capture Kurz before this occurred, but this victory is the main culprit for why he was banished, as his actions fractured the trust within the triumvirate, leading to his removal from power and exile. I mean, can you really blame them? In Angels of Caliban, Rabute Guilliman and Sanguinius explicitly forbade the lion from using orbital bombardments on McQueen just to simply flush Kurz out, due to them being concerned for civilian lives. So imagine their shock when the lion circumvented this rule by loading his drop pods with explosives and using servitors to guide them down to the surface, where Kurz was supposedly hiding. So although it's not technically an orbital bombardment, it really is still a bombardment of drop pods. So I think Guilliman's reaction to this is pretty goddamn normal, to be honest. Imagine if your brother was told not to bomb your world, and then he does so anyways, just because he wants to find your schizophrenic brother that much.
Why are you the way that you are? Honestly, every time I try to do something fun or exciting, you make it not that way. I hate so much about the things that you choose to be.
But, and there is a but, the lion did immediately afterwards come to the revelation that since Kurz saw his death at the Emperor's hands, that meant that the Emperor still lived. And so he stormed right back in to the meeting hall and convinced Guilliman and Sanguinius to attempt to reach Terra. So you gotta give points to the lion. Sanguinius would have never made the siege if he hadn't had that epiphany at that very moment. Also props to Conrad Kurz. His madness may have indeed saved the Loyalists. During their journey to Terra, the lion nearly made yet another catastrophic decision, almost ordering the destruction of Davin while Sanguinius was still on the planet. He stopped himself at the last moment, recognizing that something was influencing his judgment.
Yeah, no shit, Sherlock.
So yeah, Lion, if you had pulled that trigger, I would have immediately sentenced you to the fraud grade. But thank God you didn't. When the Ruin Storm was inevitably destroyed, the Lion decided to change tactics and launched a brutal campaign of vengeance and diversion, destroying traitor homeworlds like Chemos, Barbarous, and even Chthoniya. While this may have drawn some pressure away from Terra, it also affected the traitors in the Warp, since symbolism is everything in the Immaterium. But this also meant he was not present for the siege itself. In the end, Lionel Johnson did make it to Terra, but he arrived far too late to impact the overall outcome of the war. The siege was over, the Emperor was interred on the Golden Throne, and the war had already been decided without him. So how should we grade the Boy Wonder? Well, looking at everything, the Lion broadly did his job. He led the Dark Angels to victory over the Night Lords, shattered their legion, and ultimately captured Conrad Kurz. Even after Kurz caused chaos in Macragge, almost killing 3 Primarchs, Vulcan, the Lion, and Guilliman in the process. Yet Kurz was really a menace throughout the Imperium's Secondus arc. The Lion also aided the Loyalists in breaking through the Ruin Storm, and later led the Dark Angels in a campaign of vengeance against the traitor homeworlds. But, on the other hand, there are still some pretty major issues. He handed over siege weapons to Perturabo in the early part of the Horus Heresy, spent way too long tied up in the Thramis Crusade, effectively removing himself and one of the strongest legions from the earliest parts of the Horus Heresy. He allowed Kurz to run loose on Macragge, which led to hundreds of deaths, eternal instability, and nearly got himself, Sanguinius, and Guilliman killed, resulting in that whole situation that got him kicked out of Imperium Secondus. And then we get to the biggest issue with the Lion. Instead of joining the final push on Terra, where the Lion's intellect, combat ability, and legion would have been absolutely game-changing, he chose to go on a vengeance campaign, burning traitor worlds. Now, I'm not saying that wasn't important, because it definitely was, but it still feels like a misallocation of one of the Imperium's strongest assets and legions. So, where does that leave him? I wouldn't say the Lion was a letdown. He lived up to the hype in terms of his ability, but at the same time, I'm kinda just whelmed by it. With everything he has going for him, it feels like he should have done more throughout the Heresy. So for me, he really falls into an awkward spot between grades. He could reasonably either receive a B or a C. But when you take everything into account, I believe with all of my cow heart that Lionel Johnson should receive a B grade. He did perform well, but his decision making is what holds him back. Giving the siege weapons to Perturabo, getting stuck in the Thramis Crusade for far too long, destabilizing Imperium Secondus, and then missing the Siege of Terra entirely are massive fumbles. But he's still too impactful throughout the Heresy to receive a C grade, but not efficient enough to receive anything more than a B grade. I know that Dark Angel fans are not going to be happy with that one. At least he didn't receive a C, D, or an F. Gotta be optimistic, guys, gotta be optimistic. Next, let's move on to the speedster himself, Jekatai Khan, Primarch of the White Scars. The Khan is quite the guy. He's a Primarch defined by speed, adaptability, and quick decision making. And those traits define almost everything he does throughout the Horus Heresy. Alongside that, almost nobody truly understood him, not even his fellow Primarchs. So when the Heresy began, many genuinely didn't know which side the Khan would choose. Even members of his own legion attempted to sway him towards Horus's side, as seen in the book Horus Heresy Book 8, Malevolence. Among the Emperor's Primarchs, the Khan was among the most reclusive, bound to the hunt and the glory of the chase rather than parade ground or stratagem halls. It was often overlooked by the eyes of history. He managed no great empire, nor wrote any great treatise of war, yet his actions guided the course of the Great Crusade with quiet skill that was a hallmark of his legion. And that right there is the Khan in a nutshell. He wasn't the loudest Primarch, he wasn't building empires like Guilliman or fortresses like Dorne, but when it came time to act, his decisions consistently mattered. When the Heresy broke out, the Khan found himself isolated in the Kondak system. Unlike many of his brothers, he didn't immediately pick a side. Instead, he sought to understand, like any normal human being, what the hell was actually happening. conflicted astropathic messages flooded in. Horus attempted to court him, and even Loyalists urged him to rush to Terra. Leman Russ even tried to contact him to aid him in the Alexius Nebula against the Alpha Legion. Yet Jegatai refused to make a decision based on incomplete information, and that alone deserves credit. Rather than blindly charging into the fray, the Khan searched for the truth. And so, he broke free of the Alpha Legion blockade at Kondax and journeyed to the ruins of Prospero, where he confronted a shard of Magnus the Red. From him, he learned of Horus's betrayal and what had occurred on Prospero. You know, Leman Russ and the Space Wolves attacking and laying waste to the city, and Magnus ultimately being baned by the Wolf King himself. Later, Mortarion would arrive on the planet and attempt to recruit him to Horus's side. And even though the Khan ultimately came to the conclusion that the Emperor was flawed, he refused to join Horus, who he described as simply a slave to chaos. This would result in Mortarion and the Khan dueling, and as they fought, elements of his own legion attempted to take over Jegatai's flagship, the Swordstorm, to push the Khan into the arms of Horus. After Mortarion withdrew, the Khan handled the situation of his traitors quite well. Upon defeating them, instead of simply purging every warrior associated with Horus's rebellion, he created the Sagiar Monsan. These disgraced White Scars were given a chance to earn redemption through suicidal service against traitor forces, and they would go on to become some of the most effective and ferocious warriors in the entire Legion, fighting with wild abandon to reclaim their honor. Following the battle on and above Prospero, the Khan would begin waging a brutal hit-and-run campaign. And for the next several years, despite being vastly outnumbered and cut off from Terra due to the Ruin Storm, he constantly harassed enemy supply lines, fleets, and worlds, doing so much damage in fact that Path of Heaven states, dispersed. Strategos record 19 strikes in 3 months, 13 of which were repulsed. The tally of losses will be hurting them. He musters surely now for a final assault. That would be against 4 legions, and he has not the numbers to take on more than 1. If I were the Khan, I would be looking for a way out. Think about that for a second. The traitors had to dedicate elements of 4 legions just to stop the Khan and his legion. That's how disruptive and successful they were in their guerrilla campaign. Eventually, the Battle of Catalyst and the Calamp Gate forced the White Scars to retreat to Terra for the most pivotal part of the entire war, the Siege of Terra. And there, unlike Dorn, who favored a static defense, the Khan constantly pushed for action. He would make constant sallies beyond the walls, inflicting significant damage on the traitors, and perhaps even more importantly, saved millions of civilians who otherwise would have been abandoned to their fate. But his defining moment during the siege came during the battle for the Lionsgate spaceport. With the siege deteriorating and the traitor forces pushing deeper and deeper into the palace's defenses, the Khan proposed a bold counterattack to retake the Lionsgate spaceport. The objective of this assault wasn't simply to hurt the enemy, it was to secure a landing zone for Guilliman's reinforcements when they eventually arrived. But the most insane thing about this assault isn't that it happened, but it's the fact that it actually succeeded. And I don't think you guys truly understand how insane of an assault this really was. The Khan and his legion had to cross miles of no man's land without any cover except for one giant refurbished orbital platform, which had no armaments, mind you, and would be constantly bombed by the traitor fleet above in orbit. The assault would also be harassed by enemy aircraft, artillery, and the traitors found in no man's land. And that's not even the worst part. They also had to breach and drive the Death Guard out of the spaceport itself. And mind you, the entire Death Guard Legion was there except for a portion that Typhus had taken to retake the Astronomicon. And truly, the Loyalists may not have succeeded if it wasn't for the Khan banishing Demon Primarch Mortarion in a fight. And remember folks, Mortarion is not just some simple base Primarch at this point. He is a Demon Primarch empowered by Nurgle. On paper, this should have been an impossible fight. Mortarion would have been blessed with greater strength, durability, endurance, and the gifts of a Chaos God. But the Khan's greatest weapon was never just his speed, it was his insight. Jegatai understood Mortarion perfectly. He recognized that his brother had become complacent. Immortality had dulled him. Nurgle's gifts had made him arrogant, as he no longer feared death, and the Khan exploited that weakness. He baited Mortarion into overconfidence, provoked him into anger, and waited for the perfect opportunity. And despite being mortally wounded and impaled upon Mortarion's own scythe, the Khan made his final move, as Warhawk describes. It only took a split second. Mortarion's eyes went wide, realizing that he couldn't retch his brother away in time. The Khan's narrowed, and that makes the difference, Jagatai spat. He snapped his dao across, severing Mortarion's neck cleanly in an explosion of black bile, before collapsing down into the warp explosion that turned the landing stage briefly into the brightest object on the planet after the Emperor's tormented soul itself. So yeah, the Khan banished a demon Primarch, pretty much at the sacrifice of his own life, as he legitimately died after this and was only revived through the efforts of Malkador being aided by the Emperor. But despite that, this is still an absolutely monumental feat. As one, it stopped Mortarion's plague sorcery that was crippling the defenders. Mind you, this sorcery was even affecting Dorn, as he was beginning to crack under its effects, as Warhawk states. Rogel Dorn had been feeling it for days, weeks, building up, rising over him like a black fog, dragging at his limbs, clogging his mind, making him question every decision he made, every order he gave. He hadn't had any respite at all, of any kind, for 3 months. 3 months. His sharpness was going now. His reactions were slower. A billion functionaries depending on him for everything, reaching out to him, suffocating him, with their endless demands, pleas for help, for guidance, a billion eyes on him all the time. Had the Khan failed, Mortarion's sorcery would have continued spreading through the defenders. The palace may very well have fallen days or even weeks earlier, but that's not even the most important part. Since the Khan's near death inspired his entire legion as well as the fact that Mortarion's banishment demoralized the Death Guard and sent them running from the spaceport. The enemy never responded. They'd always been silent in combat, always oblivious to those they fought. But now they stared in a stupor at those coming towards them. The unified presentation of utter loathing, utter resolve, utter commitment. The warp, orchestrated so perfectly by their master, was draining away from every chamber like a flood surging through shattered walls and spilling out over the plains beyond. Where their opponents were now suddenly animated with this terrible, cold-as-ice fury, their own resolve had been ripped away from them without warning. When their final great roar came, it made the caverns themselves shake. The waters tremble, the iron crack, and the glass shatter. Damarg! And then they were charging, driven only by their unbounded hatred, sweeping across the ruins in a tide of ivory and gold and crimson. Unstoppable, unrestrained, the lords of the storm, the merited vengeance of heaven, the bringers of death. Without the Khan's and Mortarion's mutual destruction, the White Scars may have never broken through at that critical moment. The Lionsgate spaceport may never have fallen, and the Loyalist resistance may have buckled under the pressure of sustained chaos sorcery. So what grade do we give Jagatai Khan? And I was really tempted to give him the highest grade possible, which is an S grade, but I ultimately settled on an A grade. Don't kill me, White Scars fans, please. Early in the Heresy, Jagatai Khan's actions weren't as flashy as some of his brothers, but he still consistently made intelligent decisions, refused to rush into conflict without understanding it, preserved and redeemed elements of his legion rather than wasting them, and spent years forcing the traitors to commit massive resources just to contain him. Then during the siege, he became one of its most impactful leaders. He saved civilians, launched successful counterattacks, secured the Lionsgate spaceport, and defeated a demon Primarch. At the exact moment, the Loyalist war effort desperately needed a victory.
Hey, that's pretty good.
Most importantly, the Khan remained rational throughout the entire war. While so many other Primarchs were driven by pride, anger, bitterness, or ambition, Jagatai consistently acted with wisdom and clarity. He didn't rush into the war, he made informed decisions, and when the fate of Terra hung in the balance, he delivered. So you're probably asking yourself, why the hell did he not receive an S? Come on, Cal, you're probably thinking. He banished a demon Primarch, for Christ's sake. Well, fellas, the Khan repeatedly won critical battles, yes. But he wasn't one of the Primarchs whom the entire Loyalist war effort rested upon. Remove the Khan and the siege undoubtedly becomes far more difficult. Mortarion remains on the battlefield, the Lionsgate spaceport is never reclaimed, and the miasma of doom and despair continues to affect the Loyalists. But the Imperium still has a path to victory. His actions, although incredibly important, are not on the same caliber as some of the other Loyalist Primarchs we're going to cover later in this video. But I can't give away their grades, because that would spoil the video. So you're just gonna have to trust me for now, fellas. But yes, Jekatai Khan definitely deserves an A grade. He was simply one of the most effective Loyalist Primarchs of the entire Heresy. And speaking of Primarchs who made a massive impact on the Heresy, we now arrive at perhaps the most controversial of all of them, Leman Russ, the Wolf King. Oh boy, most people know Russ for not exactly making the greatest decisions during the Horus Heresy.
What the fuck is this?
His actions ultimately resulted in Magnus and his legion, the Thousand Sons, being driven into the arms of chaos, the destruction of Prospero, the decimation of his own legion, and the Space Wolves being absent from the Siege of Terra. But honestly, fellas, and I can't believe this is gonna come out of my mouth, I think Leman Russ gets a tougher rap than he actually deserves. A lot of the criticism thrown at him comes from the benefit of hindsight. When you actually look at the information Russ had available at that time, many of his decisions become far more understandable. In fact, I think a lot of his brothers would have made the exact same choices or potentially even worse ones. Before we get into that though, let's talk about Russ himself. Everyone already knows him as one of the deadliest warriors among the Primarchs, and arguably one of the strongest combatants in the entire Imperium. But beyond that, Russ was known as the Emperor's Executioner. His role was to carry out the Emperor's judgment and destroy those deemed too dangerous to be left alive, as we see in the Horus Hersey book Inferno. When Constantine Valdor, the Captain General of the Custodes, reflects on Russ and his legion. Not only this, but it was an open secret within the ranks of the Divisio Militaris that the Space Wolves had served many times not just as one of the vanguards of the Great Crusade, but also as one of the Emperor's preferred weapons against traitors and turncoats. It was a task for which they were eminently suited, as they stood apart in many ways from their fellow legions and the hosts of the Imperium alike, courting neither comradeship nor ties of direct fealty save to the Emperor himself. Building no nations and garrisoning few worlds, they were not the ones to raise fortresses or offer martial example to others, directing armies or standing proudly in the heart of the fires of battle. Instead, they remained, as their common name implied, a predator prowling the outer darkness, beholden to but one master. The Space Wolves Legion was truly a force that had been molded for a single purpose: to destroy utterly any threat deemed dangerous enough to warrant their attention.
Oh, I'm shaking in my custom baby seal leather boots.
In addition to this, Leman Russ himself was also loyal to a fault. And honestly, that loyalty is responsible for many of his decisions throughout the Heresy. Before the Horus Heresy even broke out, Leman Russ found himself at the center of the entire Magnus the Red situation. Following Magnus's violation of the Council of Nicaea and the catastrophic breach of the Emperor's wards on Terra, the Emperor issued orders for Magnus to be brought before the Golden Throne in chains. The original intent was clear: Magnus was to answer for his crimes, but he was to be brought back alive, not slain. However, while Russ waited for Valdor and the Terran forces to join him, he received a new message from Horus, as seen in Horus Hersey Book 7 Inferno. Their leader, Overseer Boris Kern, bore personal communications from Horus to his brother Leman Russ. The exact contents of these missives have never been made available to scholars of the later Imperium, Indeed, it is highly likely that no one other than Leman Russ and Horus themselves will ever know what arguments were brought to bear. But what is known now by the dire events, which were to transpire on Prospero, is that after viewing the contents of the message and hearing the words of his brother, Leman Russ let it be known among his sons that he no longer intended simply to capture Magnus, but instead to see him slain.
My fellow Americans, I think we all know where this is going, so let's just skip to the end.
Now, a lot of people think this is Leman Russ's first misstep. Why the hell would he not listen to the Emperor's direct order, which said to bring Magnus back alive? Why would he even listen to Horus in the first place? Well, honestly guys, it kinda makes perfect sense. At this point, Horus is the War Master, and he is effectively the Emperor's voice across the galaxy and the Great Crusade. He is also one of Russ's closest brothers. Why would Russ have any reason not to believe Horus? Why would he even believe he was lying in the first place? Add in Russ's long-standing distrust of Magnus the Red, who just blatantly violated one of the Emperor's direct commands, and through that violation, caused a massive amount of damage upon the Emperor's project. So when you look at it that way, it's pretty easy to understand why Russ accepted Horus's interpretation of events and was convinced to kill Magnus instead of capture him. Sure, you could argue that Leman Russ is still a moron for not just following the orders from the Emperor, but remember folks, hindsight is 2020. After this, we get to the Battle of Prospero itself, and we all know what happens here. Russ and the Censor fleet arrive in the Prospero system and find the world largely undefended. And despite, like I just said, Russ being ordered by Horus to kill Magnus the Red, he still doesn't immediately attack. He attempts to communicate repeatedly in the lead up to the battle, and waits in orbit before finally concluding that Magnus has no intention of surrendering. Only then does the burning of Prospero begin. Now, a lot of people like to point that Leman Russ is the sole cause of Magnus and the Thousand Sons falling to chaos. But honestly, a part of that blame has to be placed on Magnus the Red, even though he is my Pookie. And yeah, he still did nothing wrong in my eyes. Come on guys, come on. But yeah, Magnus didn't even try to communicate with Leman Russ or even surrender himself to Imperial custody. He just kinda sat there. And I know you're going to say, well, Magnus the Red wanted to pay for his crimes. Well, couldn't he have just surrendered and let the Emperor punish him for breaking the webway? Honestly, the more I read about Magnus, the more I'm convinced the guy may be the smartest in the room, but he is still an absolute moron. So, yes, the burning of Prospero then begins, and the result is catastrophic for both sides. The Thousand Sons suffer near total devastation, losing over 90% of their legion, and their homeworld of Prospero is destroyed. Magnus is shattered into countless fragments at the conclusion of his duel with Leman Russ, and although remnants of the Legion escape, the 15th Legion would never truly recover. So do I hold this against Russ? Truthfully, not really. Yes, they were his orders, but from Russ's perspective, he was carrying out the Emperor's will against a brother who had repeatedly broken Imperial law and who had seemingly been declared a traitor by the War Master himself. It's also, like I said earlier, Magnus's fault as well, as he wasn't really helpless throughout this process. Russ gave him multiple opportunities to surrender before the battle even began. Magnus chose not to respond and chose not to give himself up. Russ's job, to put it simply, was to execute traitors, and Horus told him Magnus was a traitor, and so Russ acted accordingly. And when we later learn that Magnus had already made bargains with the Chaos God Tzeentch long before Prospero, it's hard not to wonder if the fall of the Thousand Sons was already inevitable. Perhaps Russ merely accelerated the process that was already underway. In fact, in Aurelian, while guiding Lorgar, Ingathel, a demon prince, outright states Magnus is already with them 40 years before the heresy even begins. Lorgar brushed the point aside. Enough cryptic idiocy. Why not Magnus? He is the most powerful of all of us, without a shadow of doubt. Magnus the Red, the Crimson King. Ingathil laughed inside Lorgar's mind and gestured out onto the plains. He is already with us, whether he admits it or not. He came to us without needing to be summoned, and without ever considering the notion of faith. He came for power, because that is why all things of flesh come to us. And in 5 short decades, when the galaxy begins to burn, he will come here himself. Behold this very world, Lorgar, in 50 years. So essentially, Magnus is kinda doomed from the get-go. More importantly than that, Russ's victory had another massive consequence that often gets overlooked. He shattered Magnus the Red. And that single act prevented the Crimson King from operating at full strength for a majority of the Heresy, and fragmented one of the most powerful beings and Primarchs in the galaxy. For example, we see this in the last son of Prospero. One of many. The Crimson King has been broken, shattered like a mirror thrown in anger. It began when he breached the wards on Terra, and it was ended by the Wolf's Wrath. No, Jagatai, he's not dead. He's become Legion. Whether you agree with Russ's actions or not, that outcome still matters a ton. A fully intact Magnus fighting for the traitors throughout the entire Heresy would have absolutely been a terrifying prospect for the Loyalists. By shattering him, Russ removed one of the most dangerous pieces from the board for a significant portion of the Heresy. After the events of Prospero, things though only get worse for Russ and his Legion. With their fleet heavily damaged from the burning of Prospero, the Wolves are caught vulnerable by the Alpha Legion while attempting repairs, forcing Russ and his remaining Legion to retreat into the Alexius Nebula. There, they are outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and increasingly isolated, as the Space Wolves find themselves trapped with no clear path to victory. The novel of Wolf King perfectly captures just how desperate and screwed the 6th Legion had become. The Legion had been driven into the cluster by extremity, and only its extraordinarily stellar violence had kept them alive to fight on. They had been ambushed while still recovering from post-Prospero operations. Outnumbered and outmaneuvered, and only retreating into the heart of the cloud had kept them alive to fight again. Many of their ships were now incapable of making for the warp even if the gas tides had allowed. So the Wolves were cornered, wounded, and lean with hunger, forced into retreat by an enemy with greater resources and infinite patience. They were harried at every turn, driven onwards like cattle before the whip, until the madness of confinement ran like a virus through the decks. So the Space Wolves Legion, after Prospero, were trapped and nearing annihilation by the Alpha Legion schemes. And in this situation is where I will admit Russ becomes a far more interesting character. Throughout the Great Crusade, in the opening stages of the Horus Hersey, Russ is extremely confident in his own judgment. He sees himself as the Emperor's executioner, a loyal hound who carries out unpleasant duties without question.
Not only is he loyal, but he knows tricks too. Watch and learn. Sit, Rex, sit. Roll over, Rex, roll over.
But after Prospero, Magnus's near death, and the near destruction of his Legion, that certainty begins to crack. In fact, Russ is one of the few Primarchs who undergoes a genuine character arc throughout the Horus Heresy. As the Alexius Nebula campaign drags on, and the Wolves edge closer and closer to annihilation, Russ finally begins questioning many of the assumptions that has guided most of his life. He realizes that blindly serving the Emperor as a weapon has brought ruin not only to Magnus and Prospero, but to his own Legion as well. With this revelation and the situation growing more and more hopeless, Russ withdraws into his private chambers. And with him absent, his first captain, Gunnar Gunhilt, is forced to assume command and attempts to lead a desperate breakout attempt, which of course does not go very well. But in their darkest moment, Russ returns. Finally reaching a new understanding of himself, he emerges from seclusion and pledges to forge his own path rather than continue to live solely as the Emperor's executioner. During the fighting, Russ seemingly crossed blades with Alfarius himself, though the Primarch of the Alpha Legion was disguised as an ordinary Terminator. Despite that, the Wolves appeared destined for destruction, but their salvation arrived from an unexpected source. A Dark Angel Starfort named Chimera, who intercepted Russ's distress signal and determined the Space Wolves were the true loyalists in the conflict. With the arrival of the Dark Angels, the balance of the battle shifted, forcing the Alpha Legion to withdraw. Battered, bloodied, and reduced in strength, Russ and his Legion were finally able to retreat towards the Throne World, rejoining the wider Loyalist war effort. And with that, we reach the end of the Leman-Russ saga. As after returning to Terra, Russ was convinced that his destiny was to confront Horus Lupercal, and chose to leave Terra despite the objections of Rogel Dorn and Sanguinius, both of whom desperately wanted every available legion present for the coming siege. Using intelligence acquired at Molech, the wolves ambushed the vengeful spirit, and there, Russ personally confronted the War Master, armed with the Dionysian Spear, a spear created by the Emperor and amplified by his arcane might. During their duel, Russ deliberately allowed himself to be wounded in order to create an opening and drive his spear into Horus's side. That strike was not fatal, but it inflicted a devastating soul wound and briefly freed Horus from the corruption of chaos. This is another tough part of attempting to grade Russ. On one hand, Russ had Horus dead to rights. He was presented with perhaps the single greatest opportunity in the entire Heresy, to end the war before it ever reached Terra, as due to the effects of the Dionysian Spear, Horus was completely at Russ's mercy. Instead, Russ hesitated when he saw a glimpse of his brother beneath the corruption. And well, that hesitation cost him about everything. Horus would immediately recover, nearly killed Russ, who was caught off guard, and the Space Wolves were forced to sacrifice themselves to pull their Primarch from the battlefield. And the cost for the 6th Legion was so catastrophic, guys, you have no idea. Around 4/5 of the remaining Legion, which is roughly 32,000 Space Wolves, were either killed or wounded during this battle, leaving only around 8,000 battle-worthy warriors left for the remainder of the Heresy. And because of this, the 6th Legion not only missed the entirety of the Siege of Terra, but effectively the rest of the Horus Heresy. At the same time, Russ's attack was not without benefits. The soul wound dealt from the Dionysian Spear nearly killed Horus and left him weakened enough that it contributed to Lorgar launching his failed coup, as we see in the book Slaves to Darkness. That failure kept the Wordbearers from fully participating in the Siege of Terra, and created major instability amongst the traitor ranks. But you could also argue the exact opposite. Horus's wounded soul ultimately led to Malachurst sacrificing himself to restore and reunify the War Master's fractured essence. The result was arguably an even stronger and more complete Horus. A Horus who would eventually stand before the Emperor and mortally wound him during their final duel aboard the Vengeful Spirit as seen in The End and the Death Part 3. So depending on how you look at all of it, Russ either made one of the most important Loyalist plays of the entire Heresy, or one of the most costliest mistakes. Either way, his decision permanently crippled the 6th Legion, and removed them from the war at the moment the Imperium needed every legion it could get its hands on. So how the hell do we grade Leman-Russ? Well, I think it comes down to 3 defining moments across the Heresy. First, Prospero, where Russ defeated Magnus the Red, shattered the Thousand Suns, and removed what could have become one of the traitors' most powerful assets. Was Magnus loyal at that moment? Technically yes, but Magnus had already broken the Emperor's personal decree of the Council of Nicaea, bargained with Tzeentch, the Lord of Change, and was spiraling towards chaos. Russ was carrying out what he believed to be orders from the Emperor. In hindsight, it was a disaster, but I don't really place the blame entirely on Leman-Russ. He did the job he was sent to do, and he did it very effectively. Second, we have the Alexius Nebula campaign, and this one is, I'm gonna admit, pretty damn hard to defend for Leman-Russ. Russ placed his legion in a vulnerable position while recovering from the Battle of Prospero, and paid dearly because of it. The Alpha Legion nearly annihilated the 6th Legion, and Russ himself even withdrew for a time while his sons fought for survival. To his credit, this is also where his character growth begins, as he realizes the flaws in blindly acting as the Emperor's executioner. Still, the losses were enormous for his legion, and it has to count against him. Finally, we come to his attack on Horus, during the events of Wolfsbane. Here we see Russ abandon Terra and sacrifice most of what remained of his legion, launching a desperate gamble to kill the War Master. The The crazy thing about this though is it literally almost worked. Russ actually got the opening he needed and inflicted a devastating soul wound on Horus. But when the moment actually came to slay the arch-traitor, Russ hesitated.
Are you stupid or something?
He saw his brother instead of the monster Horus had become, which resulted in him failing to land the killing blow. And that's where grading Russ becomes so goddamn difficult. If Russ never wounds Horus, then Horus arrives at Terra much weaker, but the Wordbearers likely remain fully involved in the siege of Terra, meaning that the might of the Wordbearers Legion and Lorgar would be brought to bear throughout the extent of the siege. If Russ does wound Horus, which happens in canon, Lorgar's coup removes the Wordbearers Legion from the rest of the Heresy, but Horus is eventually reforged into an even more powerful version of himself, as seen in the events of Slaves to Darkness. One outcome gives the traitors more manpower and another Primarch. The other, which happens in canon, gives the traitors a much stronger War Master. So where does that leave Russ? Well, I'm going to say bluntly, I can't justify an S or an A grade. The losses are simply too great for the Space Wolves, and several of his biggest decisions directly contribute to weakening the Loyalist war effort. At the same time, I can't exactly throw him into the F or D grade tiers. He shattered Magnus, crippled the Thousand Sons, nearly killed Horus, and remained one of the Imperium's most important Primarchs throughout the war, although he made a lot of moronic decisions. For me, Russ either receives a B or C grade. What to pick? Let me consult my cat real quick.
Huh?
Alright. I've come to the conclusion that Leman Russ receives a B grade, or to be more specific, a B-. Even though his mistakes were huge, but at that same time, it's impossible to ignore the results. Russ shattered Magnus the Red. He crippled the 15th Legion as a fighting force, and prevented one of the traitors' most dangerous assets from operating at full strength for the remainder of the war. He survived the disaster of the Alexius Nebula, learned from his failures, and then came closer than almost anyone to ending the Heresy outright. His strike against Horus inflicted a devastating soul wound that almost killed the War Master and sent shockwaves throughout the traitor leadership. For all his mistakes, the Loyalists are probably worse off without him than with him. For that reason, I'm going to give Leman Russ a B grade. And I don't know what's wrong with me, guys. I don't know why I'm helping the Space Wolves out and actually fairly grading them for once. I should have given Leman Russ an F for hell's sake. First, I make an entire video glazing the Wolf King, and now I'm sitting here actually giving him a respectable, balanced grade. Guys, I don't know what's wrong with me. I think I need to go to the doctor. But thankfully, my Pookie, the golden boy of the Heresy, and the man who looks like a yellow brick road is up next. Yep, that's right. It's Chattel Dorn time. As you all know, I am a proud member and founder of the Chattel Dorn fan club. And Dorn is arguably, and this might be a little bit of a spoiler, one of the most important Loyalist Primarchs. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before the Heresy even began, Dorn was already preparing the throne world for a potential siege in the aftermath of the Ulanor campaign, as Dorn and the entire 7th Legion were recalled to Terra as the Emperor began work on his secret Webway project. While his other brothers continued the Great Crusade, Dorn was named the Praetorian of Terra, and was put in charge in safeguarding the heart of the Imperium. He stayed at the side of the Emperor, overseeing the defenses of Terra, and transforming the Imperial Palace into the greatest fortress the galaxy had ever seen. And when you start looking at Dorn's abilities, it becomes pretty obvious why he was given this responsibility. As according to Horus Hersey Book 3, Extermination, we see just how gifted Dorn is when it comes to both fortifying and willpower. If the Primarchs were the Emperor's nature split like white light through a prism's rays, as many scholars of the Imperial Court suggested, then, from such a point of view, Rogel Dorn was the Emperor's implacable discipline in the pursuit of the cause given flesh, a being without compromise, and in who loyalty and duty was as integral as blood and breath. This really captures who Dorn truly is. He is utterly dependable. Duty, loyalty, discipline, and perseverance are particularly hardwired into his very being. Dorn is a Primarch who simply refuses to bend, refuses to break, and refuses to abandon his responsibility no matter the cost.
That's what I'm talking about.
What's even more interesting is that in the book The Lost and the Damned, we are given a hint at Dorn's other talents, which extend far beyond simply building walls. During a conversation with Malcador the Sigillite, we get this. "Was it?" said Malcador softly. "Very well, let us take you, Dorn. You were made to command the material realm. Nothing in this world is beyond your grasp." Now, depending on how literally you want to take this excerpt, it still implies that if Malcador is being serious, that Dorn was engineered to master virtually any discipline within the material universe. Whether that means engineering, logistics, strategy, administration, siegecraft, fortification, or void warfare, Dorn possessed an intellect uniquely suited to understanding and controlling the physical world around him.
That's why he's the GOAT! The GOAT!
And to be frank, that kind of tracks with everything we've already seen from him, as he is one of the greatest Void commanders, one of the most disciplined strategists in the Imperium, and arguably the single greatest defensive commander humanity has ever produced. The Emperor could not have picked a better Primarch to stand guard over Terra.
Hey, if you forgot it, it probably wasn't all that important.
Yeah, I guess.
Which is incredibly fortunate for him, because the heresy that was about to come would test every single one of those talents to their absolute limit. Dorn would begin the heresy stranded by warp storms, and would be cut off from any reliable communications. And so, he initially refused to believe the reports that Horus had betrayed the Imperium. It was only after the survivors of the Eisenstein, particularly Nathaniel Garrow and Mercedes Olaton, personally testifying to Horus's treachery at Istvan to make Dorn accept the truth. Realizing the Imperium was on the brink of civil war, he dispatched as many of the Imperial fists as he could spare towards Istvan, while he personally returned to Terra to warn the Emperor and prepare for the coming siege. While the Emperor was confined to the war in the Webway, Dorn was appointed Lord Commander of the Imperium. In the first years of the Horus Heresy, he spent his time transforming Terra into one of the most heavily defended fortresses in human history. While Malcador managed the political affairs of the Imperium, Dorn oversaw the military response, dividing the Sol system into multiple layers, designed to delay Horus for as long as possible. During this period, he achieved one of the most important Loyalist victories, when he defeated and seemingly killed Alfarius during the Battle of Pluto, removing one of the traitor Primarchs from the war effort. And for those Alpha Legion fans out there who are going to say, "What do you mean, Cow? Dorn didn't kill Alfarius, that was a decoy." Well, for one, John French himself, the author of Praetorian of Dorn, confirmed that Alfarius was indeed killed by Dorn. And two, we also have confirmation from the end of their fight, when Alfarius literally detonated in a ball of light, like all Primarchs do when they die. Rogel Dorn brought Storm's teeth around. The blade cut down through Alfarius' skull, and then tore free in a spray of blood and a detonation of light. So yeah, Alfarius is dead. Deal with it, Alpha Legion fans. I know you're all schizophrenic, but trust me, this one is completely correct. But besides killing a traitor Primarch, one of the most overlooked consequences of Rogel Dorn killing Alfarius during the Battle of Pluto is what it did to the Alpha Legion as a fighting force. While the Alpha Legion still operated during the Siege of Terra, the Legion itself was largely absent from the fighting. Instead of committing one of Horus's largest and most deceptive legions to the most decisive battle of the Heresy, Omegon effectively withdraws his legion after Alfarius' death. Officially, this can be explained by Omegon recognizing that the siege has become unwinnable. but I think there's a deeper explanation. My personal theory is that Alpharius was the true traitor, while Omegon was ultimately the true loyalist, or at the very least, loyal to humanity rather than Horus. Following his twin's death, Omegon had no interest in helping Horus achieve victory. This theory is supported by Slaves to Darkness. As the conclusion of the book, the Alpha Legion gives Horus purposely misleading schematics of the Sol system. Data shown in halos around them, flowing with strength, specifications, tactical weaknesses, and threat reaction parameters. Argonis recognized the image. It was a strategic view of the solar system, but threaded and woven with information on every detail of its defenses. From communication response times to main troop strengths. It was staggering, a treasure of intelligence from the heart of Rogel Dorn's fortress. "You have my thanks," said Horus. Behind him, the projection of the solar system spun, its secrets unfolding like flowers in sunlight. "You've done as I asked, but come alone. Where is your legion?" Alpharius did not move for a long moment. Reflections of the display flowed across the green lenses of his helm. Then he drew the knife from his waist. The motion was simple, not a grand flourishing or threat-filled flash, but still the Justeri twitched. Horus did not move. Alpharius held the dagger up. It was long and double-edged. Twin serpents were etched on the blade to match the grip, one coiling towards the hilt, one towards the tip. Alpharius held it still for a second, then reached up with his other hand. He gripped the blade. Razor edges bit into ceramite. Argonis realized what he was going to do an instant before the blade shattered in Alpharius' grasp. He opened his hand. The silvers of metal fell between the fingers like sharp petals of a crushed rose. Then he dropped the dagger's hilt at Horus's feet, turned and walked towards the door. The Justeri moved to stop him, but Horus gave a small shake of his head. So we see here, supposedly Alpharius giving Horus the schematics to the entire solar system. But we don't find out till later that these plans were very misleading and completely incorrect. A deliberate act to manipulate Horus's strategic decisions at the most important stage of the war. And the breaking of the twin serpent dagger is a symbolic act that symbolizes that the Alpha Legion is finished with Horus's cause, signifying their end in the Horus Heresy, at least on Horus's side. Whether you believe that Alpharius was actually a traitor and Omegon was still a loyalist, the outcome is still difficult to ignore. One of the 9 traitor legions was effectively removed just before the siege began. So instead of facing the full strength of the 20th Legion, the Loyalists only had to contend with scattered agents and isolated cells. Just imagine how deadly the Alpha Legion could have been if they would have been there at their full might. There would have been constant infiltration, sabotages, and assassinations, and the Imperium's defense would have suffered greatly. So, way to go, Dorn! You didn't just kill one Primarch, you effectively took out an entire legion with one swing of your chainsword. Who knew Count Dookuing someone could be so effective?
Do it.
I guess Dorn and Anakin Skywalker have something in common. As the heresy dragged on, Dorn found himself carrying an impossible burden. He was coordinating the defenses of the Loyalist effort, managing relations between the Loyalist Primarchs, and attempting to buy enough time for Guilliman and the Lion to break through the Ruin Storm, all while the traitors slowly closed in. And finally, 7 years after Istvan, the Solar War began. As the massive armada of traitors finally entered the Sol system, they were met by the 5 layers of defenses prepared by Dorn and manned by his sons, with Dorn himself commanding the final sphere, directly over Terra. But even with this mastercrafted defense, there were just simply too many traitors. And even though the traitors paid dearly, the Loyalists began to give ground. Even when Samus and other Chaos Demons managed to infiltrate the Phalanx, Dorn's flagship, through the possession of Mercedes Ultin, Dorn was able to hold the line and personally fought against Samus for an extended period of time until Mercedes Ultin's sacrifice destroyed the warp rift aboard the Phalanx and ended the threat. But by the time Samus was defeated, the Solar War was already over. The traitors had broken through all 5 layers, and so the Siege of Terra began. and Dorn, of course, served as the overall commander of the Loyalist defenses. His strategy was simple: trade space for time. Every wall, bastion, trench, and fortress existed for one singular purpose: to delay Horus long enough for Leman to arrive. This is because Dorn understood something that the other Loyalist Primarchs did not. Their only path to victory was survival, as the Loyalists could not win outright. On his side, he had around 300 to 350,000 Loyalist Space Marines, along with 200 million guardsmen and mechanized combatants. While on the traitor side, there was an absolutely absurd force. Anywhere from 500,000 to 750,000 traitor Astartes, backed by millions to billions of traitor guardsmen and warp entities. So Dorn really had the odds stacked against him, and still the Loyalists held for 5 to 6 months, until time itself basically stopped mattering. Through it all, he successfully defended key positions, organized withdrawals before they became routes, and even set the infamous Saturn Night trap, after identifying a weakness Perturabo would probably exploit. The trap shattered one of the Sons of Horus's most ambitious assaults, and contributed directly to Fulgrim and the Emperor's children withdrawing from the siege altogether. Dorn also personally intervened in this battle, even managing to hold Fulgrim off long enough for him to grow bored, and may have been the sole reason he abandoned the siege in the first place. Yep, if we're looking at the scoreboard, that's 2-0 for Dorn on the Primarch duel record. You guys better respect my Buki. Perhaps the most impressive aspect of Dorn's performance is that he accomplished all of this while mentally and physically destroying himself. By the final months of the siege, he'd effectively gone 3 months without rest. The constant pressure, endless casualties, and responsibility for the fate of humanity were slowly crushing even a Primarch. Yet, he never stopped working, even when he privately admitted that the war was likely lost. He continued issuing orders and organizing defenses because there was simply no one else who could do it. As seen in the book Warhawk, Rogel Dorn had been feeling it for days, weeks, building up, rising over him like a black fog, dragging at his limbs, clogging his mind, making him question every decision he made, every order he gave. He hadn't had any respite at all, of any kind, for 3 months. 3 months. His sharpness was going now. His reactions were slower. 1 billion functionaries depending on him for everything, reaching out to him, suffocating him with their endless demands, pleas for help, for guidance. 1 billion eyes on him all the time. The weight of the entire species, all their frailties and imperfections, wrapped tight around his mouth and throat and nostrils, choking him, drowning him, making him want to cry out loud, to cower away from it. Something he would never do, could never do, and so he remained where he was, caught between the infinite weight of Horus's malice and the infinite demands of the Emperor's will. And it would break him, he knew it, break him open like the walls themselves, which were about to break now too, despite all he had done. But had it been enough? Yes, it had. No, it could not have been. They would break, they must not break. Yeah, so at the end of the Siege of Terra, Dorn himself is getting a little, schizo. But this all culminates in one of the most absurd feats of willpower in the entire Heresy. During the final assault aboard the Vengeful Spirit, Dorn becomes trapped within a warp construct designed by the Chaos God of Blood and War, Khorne himself. And this pocket dimension is literally designed to break him and make him fall to chaos. There, Dorn is isolated, exhausted, and stripped of nearly all of his memories, and subjected to constant mental torment by Khorne. But somehow, even there, he still refuses to yield, as the end and the death part 1 and part 2 shows us, that even when reduced to little more than a shell of himself, Dorn's stubbornness refuses to break. He tries to order the available facts. He was a warrior who just wished to kill. They wouldn't let him. They wanted him to think. They wanted him to decide everything. They wanted him to order the available facts, because they said he was good at it. He didn't want to decide. He didn't want to have to make those decisions. It was killing him. He never told anyone that. He wanted to stop and make somebody else decide. Make somebody else order the available facts. All he wanted to do was go to the walls and forget it all and fight, a man with a sword. Just fight, no thought. No decisions, just fight, mindlessly, free, the way the others did. Just fight, spill blood, that's all, just blood. Blood for the just give up. I am Rogel Dorn, defiant, says Rogel Dorn. Dorn, to put it in the most simplest terms, is quite literally too autistic to fall to chaos.
Oh my god, he's so goddamn cool!
As this goes on for centuries and centuries, at least in the mind of Rogel Dorn. But eventually, the Emperor himself dispels the war prison and allows Dorn to reunite with the surviving Loyalists aboard the Vengeful Spirit. There he witnesses the aftermath of Horus's death and helps return the mortally wounded Emperor to the Golden Throne. In many ways, Dorn's final contribution to the Horus Heresy was perhaps his most important. Without him, there is a very real possibility that the Emperor never reaches the Golden Throne in time. But you could also make the argument that this wasn't the most helpful thing to do, as newer lore has made this a very complicated decision. This is seen in the newest Scouring book, The Ashes of the Imperium, which reveals in the immediate aftermath of the Heresy, the Chaos Gods were effectively crippled. The warp's connection to real space was severely diminished, and demonic manifestations were nearly impossible. Because of this, some fans have argued that the Emperor's immediate internment upon the Golden Throne may have not been strictly necessary. If the webway breach was no longer under immediate threat of demonic incursion, perhaps the Emperor could have been given time to recover naturally, since he is a perpetual. In theory, a recuperating Emperor might even have eventually restored the shattered wards Magnus had broken and reclaimed portions of the Imperial Webway project. The problem with that theory is that it runs headfirst into what the Heresy novels themselves tell us about the Emperor. By the end of The End and the Death, the Emperor is not merely injured, he is on the brink of death. Malcador is fairly explicit that the Emperor must be placed upon the throne or he will perish, while the throne itself is also on the brink of catastrophic failure without him. So while the newer lore certainly raises some interesting questions, we probably won't have a definitive answer until future books expand on exactly what happened in those first days after the siege's conclusion. For now, Dorn's decision remains the safest and most reasonable one that could have been made with the information available. So what does this all mean for grading my Buki? Well, does Rogel Dorn really need much of a debate? To summarize, he was the architect of Terra's defenses. He coordinated the Loyalist war effort while the Emperor was trapped on the Golden Throne. He bought time for the Imperium throughout the siege. He defeated Alfarius and removed the Alpha Legion from the traitor war effort, and delayed Horus long enough for Guilliman's arrival to become a real possibility, forced Fulgrim to abandon the field, along with the Emperor's children, resisted Khorne's corruption for what felt like centuries deep within the warp, and ultimately helped save the Emperor's life at the conclusion of The End and the Death Part 3. More than any other Loyalist Primarch, Dorn was the foundation that Terra stood upon. The Khan may have won glorious victories, Russ may have wounded Horus, but Dorn was the one holding the entire war effort together while everyone else was off doing heroic Primarch things. Without Dorn, Terra falls. It's really that simple, fellas. And so, this is the easiest S grade in this entire video. At least, I hope so. Come on guys, the Dorn agenda remains undefeated, forever and always. And frankly, after reading the Siege of Terra, I'm not even sure this is an agenda anymore. It's just what happened. Yes, you all must accept that Dorn is the GOAT of all time. He is the Michael Jordan of Loyalist Primarchs. I wonder if Sanguinius is LeBron. Well, let's find out if the glorious Hawkboy can also be considered one of the greatest Primarchs. The Angel, the sacrificial son, the brightest of all the Primarchs, Sanguinius. Yep, we're grading Sanguinius next, the Primarch of the Blood Angels, who is widely remembered for his final stand against Horus at the climax of the Siege of Terra.
Excuse me.
But
reducing his legacy to that single moment does him a massive disservice, as throughout the Heresy, Sanguinius consistently proved himself as one of the greatest Primarchs in virtually every category. As a warrior, he excelled. As a commander, he excelled.
someone cooked here.
And perhaps most importantly, as a leader, he was able to inspire loyalty and hope in an age defined by despair.
We're not worthy! We're not worthy! We're not worthy! We're stuck!
His death remains one of the most tragic moments in the entire 40K lore. But in many ways, it literally had to happen. If the brightest and most noble of the Emperor's sons didn't fall, then the grim darkness of the far future may not have happened at all. Let's first talk about Sanguinius' reputation as a general and a Primarch. And as stated in Horus Hersey Book 8, Malevolence, we see how great of a reputation he has amongst the Primarchs. Often considered to be the greatest of his kin, Sanguinius is a peerless warrior, masterful strategist, and beloved hero of the Imperium. Among the Primarchs, there were few who would speak ill of him, such as Perturabo and Ferrus Manus, offering grudging praises of their winged brother. And that reputation is exactly why Horus and Erebus viewed him as a very dangerous threat. One of the earliest major attempts by Chaos to alter the course of the Horus Heresy centered entirely around Sanguinius and his legion, the Blood Angels. Because at Cygnus Prime, the forces of Chaos constructed a carefully designed trap, either to corrupt Sanguinius into joining Horus and Chaos, or to eliminate him entirely before he could become a threat, as Horus himself explains in the book Fear to Tread. Moment by shuddering moment, Creed rose to his knees, and then to his feet, blinking bloody tears from his eyes, spitting gobs of ejecta to the deck. We agreed. This place, this colossal trap. The entire purpose of it was to contain the Blood Angels, to push them to the abyss, to bring them to our banner or destroy them. Yes, said Horus, I gave you the key to them. Use it. Strip away their dutiful nobility and virtue. Break them and bring me what is left. Make weapons of them for my crusade. The War Master seemed to sense his thoughts, even across the light years. He said, I want the Blood Angels for the crusade against my father, so he can see his folly, so the Imperium can know that even the most noble can be corrupted, but not my dear brother.
It's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off for him.
So as you can see, Horus wanted the Blood Angels, but wished that Sanguinius would die, because the Bald Menace was very scared that Sanguinius would become the favorite of the gods if he fell to Chaos, supplanting him as the War Master. And so, once the Blood Angels and Sanguinius were trapped within the Cygnus Prime system, they were attacked by demonic forces on an unimaginable scale. And can you imagine the horrors of facing demons for the first time? Remember, folks, that during the Great Crusade, the Emperor told all the Legiones Astartes and his sons that gods and demons were not real. So imagine the horror of facing them for the first time when you've been told lies that there are no such things as demons. Yeah, I would shit my pants too. During the campaign, Sanguinius would duel the Bloodthirster, Kabanda, one of Khorne's greatest champions. And in their duel, he would suffer a devastating defeat, when the demon would shatter his legs and leave him unconscious. Kabanda would then proceed to slaughter 500 Blood Angels, fueling a psychic weapon known as the Balefire. This psychic weapon would then plunge Sanguinius into a coma and unleash the Red Thirst throughout the Blood Angels Legion, driving many of his sons into an uncontrollable bloodlust. Yet even here, Sanguinius would succeed, as with the help of his librarians, he would recover and proceed to do what he does best, Aura Farm, as seen in the book Fear to Tread. With the whip still coiled around his neck, the angel dragged the spitting, wounded fiend to the lip of the pit in the middle of the chamber, then lifted it up so he could look it in the face. The demon cackled through its pain, convulsing as it tried to shake free. I will take your skull yet. The Primarch's eyes flashed with a powerful hatred. If you truly do hail from the realm that men once called Hell, he intoned, when you return there, tell your kindred it was Sanguinius who threw you back. With a grunt of effort, the angel took hold of the beast and shoved it over the spiked edge. Cabanda's curses echoed all the way down, before it finally vanished, shrieking into the warp flames. After defeating Cabanda, Sanguinius would storm the Cathedral of the Mark and confront yet another greater demon, this time a keeper of secrets, Chris the Perverse. Here, Sanguinius would face yet another challenge. The choice of sacrificing himself to remove the flaw of his legion, the Red Thirst, or condemning his sons to future suffering if he refused chaos. And insanely enough, Sanguinius was fully prepared to sacrifice his life. But thank God that didn't happen, as the intervention and sacrifice of Apothecary, Mayros prevented him from doing so. Can you guys imagine if Sanguinius actually died in the very beginning of the Heresy? I'd probably crash out at least 6 or 7 times.
Stop it. Get some help.
After escaping Cygnus Prime, Sanguinius would attempt to make his way to Terra, but due to the Ruin Storm, warp travel across the Imperium was nearly impossible. So following the psychic beacon of the Pharos device, he would eventually arrive on Macrack and join Guilliman and Lionel Johnson with forming Imperium Secundus. And while Guilliman was reluctant to form this empire, he ultimately named Sanguinius its Emperor Regent. I mean, who else would you name Emperor? The dude literally has wings, guys, come on. Outside of having wings, that decision says a lot. Even among the other Primarchs, Sanguinius was viewed as the one most naturally suited to rule. But at this same time, throughout the Imperium Secundus arc, Sanguinius began suffering increasingly vivid visions of his own death at the hands of Horus Lubercal. Unlike many prophetic visions in Warhammer 40K, Sanguinius eventually came to understand that he was witnessing actual future events. He knew he would die facing Horus. Outside of seeing his own death, for the remainder of the Imperium Secundus plotline, Sanguinius would fight Kurz, banish the Lion from their mini-empire, and ultimately was going to sentence Kurz to death, before the Lion returned and pleaded with Sanguinius that if Kurz's visions were correct, then the Emperor still lived. Sanguinius then recognized that his own visions of death would also be true. After Imperium Secundus was disbanded, the 3 Loyalist Primarchs, Guilliman, the Lion, and Sanguinius, would try to search for a pathway through the Ruin Storm towards Terra. Guided by visions, he led the Loyalist fleet to Davin, the very world where Horus had first fallen to chaos. There the demon Maddale attempted to corrupt him with visions of a perfect future. Where Horus was defeated, the Imperium was saved, and Sanguinius ruled as the Emperor's chosen heir. More importantly though, Chaos offered him a cure to the Red Thirst. But despite every temptation placed before him, Sanguinius refused every offer. He rejected Chaos, and the Loyalist Primarch destroyed Davin. And with its destruction, a pathway through the Warp Storm was opened and allowed the Hawkboy to finally make it to Terra. And on Terra, Sanguinius' heroics truthfully began.
I have arrived.
If Dorn was the brains behind the siege, Sanguinius was the heart and soul of the Imperium. Wherever the fighting was the fiercest, the Angel was there, bringing hope to its defenders simply with his presence. He repeatedly ignored Dorn's orders to remain safely behind the walls, launching sorties to rescue stranded soldiers, reinforcing collapsing fronts, and inspiring defenders who were on the verge of breaking. At the Gorgon Bar, Sanguinius personally destroyed a Warlord Titan by assaulting it head-on, an achievement so absurd that the accompanying Warhound Titans reportedly fled the battlefield rather than face him. I mean, I'd probably do the same. There's no shame in that. But his greatest feats came at the Eternity Gate. As the final defenses of the Imperial Palace collapsed around him, Sanguinius stood at the last gate protecting the Sanctum Imperialis. There he proceeded to put together one of the most ridiculous combat runs in all of 40k. First he slew the greater bloodthirster Cabanda for the second time.
Not bad, not bad.
Then despite already being exhausted and wounded from countless battles across the siege, he faced down Demon Primarch Angron, and he still managed to win.
Are you kidding me?
As the two fought a brutal aerial fight across the Imperial Palace, Angron impaled Sanguinius with the Black Blade, but Sanguinius responded by ripping the butcher's nails from Angron's skull, banishing the Demon Primarch back into the warp. With Angron gone, the World Eaters descended into complete madness and began slaughtering their own allies, helping halt the traitors' assault just short of the Eternity Gate. Think about that for just a moment, fellas. During the same battle, Sanguinius defeated both Kabanda and Demon Primarch Angron, and somehow he is still not done, guys. At this point, Sanguinius was already dying from his wounds, as Malcador himself notices in The End and the Death Part 1. And Sanguinius, his physical wounds are greater, though he hides them from others behind the aura of his being. He can't hide them from me. Beneath his projected radius, I can see the damage to his armor and his body, the open wounds, the tattered and scorched feathers of his wings. Now he is back inside the sanctum. The aegis of his father's protective spirit is healing him, faster than any mortal could ever heal. But it is not enough. He may never be whole again. He will bear some of these crippling injuries for the remainder of his life. And even with these injuries, he still pleads to partake in the Anubis operation to assault the vengeful spirit, even after being ordered by the Emperor not to do so. At this point, he privately confronts the Emperor and openly admits to him that he knew Horus would kill him. But regardless of knowing this fate, he would still choose to face it in the hope that he would somehow change it. Even more though, Sanguinius thought if he didn't go fight Horus, there was a chance that Horus would survive and come to find him again. This is seen in The End and the Death Part 1. If it is ordained that I am to die at Lubrical's hand, says Sanguinius, then I can't let you go alone, because that means Horus will survive so he can come for me again afterwards. Don't you see? If I stay, Horus lives. And if Horus lives, then you will have failed. Sanguinius. I must face the last permutation. I must force it. I can't allow for the possibility of another, for the cost to us will be too much. So yet again, Sanguinius willingly walks towards his own death, both to give the Emperor a chance at emerging victorious, but also in the attempt to cheat death, since technically time and space had broken down due to Terra sinking into the warp. If there was a chance to cheat fate, it was now. Teleporting aboard the vengeful spirit, Sanguinius and his company would be separated from the Emperor, Dorn, and Valdor, forcing them to fight through a horde of Sons of Horus, demons, and traitor elites all by themselves, before Sanguinius, alone, finally reached Horus. And once again, Chaos offered him everything it could: power, glory, and a place besides Horus as ruler of the galaxy. And once again, Sanguinius refused. And so their duel began. Already exhausted from months of war, wounded from fighting Kabanda and Angron, and facing a Horus empowered by all four Chaos Gods, Sanguinius still attacked with everything he had, and Horus initially tried to defeat him through skill alone, hoping to break his spirit and turn him to the ruinous pantheon. Instead, Sanguinius fought so ferociously that Horus was forced to abandon that plan, and unleashed his full power to kill the magnificent Hawkboy. And even I'll admit it, fellas, Sanguinius' death is very, very brutal and gruesome, as Sanguinius does not die heroically, but as someone in the grimdark future of 40K would. This is his death as seen in The End and the Death Part 2. As he falls forward, the Talon vices him again. It lifts the ruined, tattered angel into the air, until he is face to face with the first found instrument of chaos. Horus squeezes slowly. He's expecting some last words, some immortal and heroic declaration to mark the end of a majestic, noble life. It ought to be something good, something appropriate. But Sanguinius is no longer capable of speech. He is drowning in his own blood. The claws close. There is a double crack of spine and neck. Horus waits. Blood drips. It's done. The talon opens with a mechanical clank. His brother's corpse, so loose and mangled, it seems almost boneless, drops to the deck. An ugly sound of impact to mark an ugly ending. Horus sighs and walks away. Things scurry forward from the shadows to nail the body up. I know, right guys? I'm fighting back tears as well. So when we actually look at the scoreboard, Sanguinius' feats are just simply absurd. He resisted chaos on multiple occasions, Even when the gods were actively trying to corrupt him, he defeated several greater demons throughout the Heresy, destroyed titans, carried countless battles through sheer force of will and personal heroism, banished a demon Primarch at the height of the Siege of Terra, became a symbol of hope for an entire dying Imperium, and in the end, he knowingly marched towards his own death, one that he had foreseen years in advance. Because there was even the slightest chance it would improve humanity's odds and increase the likelihood of the Emperor succeeding. Yeah, this one isn't even much of a debate either. Sanguinius easily receives a S grade and is definitely in the running for MVP of the Loyalist Primarchs. Oh boy, oh my. Next up is the Primarch of the Iron Hands, Ferrus Manus, who, as everyone knows, has iron hands, leads the Iron Hands, and commands the Fist of Iron. Even crazier, Iron Hands in Latin means Ferrus Manus. Truly, Games Workshop was cooking when naming him. The biggest problem with Ferrus Manus is that he dies so early on in the Horus Hersey that we never really get to see a complete character arc. In fact, one of the few major looks we get at him in Gorgon of Medusa, his Primarch novel, arguably makes him look like a total moron. Throughout the extent of the book, Ferrus is repeatedly shown as stubborn, hot-headed, and obsessed with proving his strength. Ferrus becomes so fixated on victory being achieved his way that he orders the destruction of an entire world despite the Emperor's wishes. The result is a catastrophe on an almost unimaginable scale, with billions dead and countless Imperial soldiers sacrificed for little practical gain. By the end of the book, even some of the victories achieved feel hollow, because Ferrus has burned through so many lives just to accomplish them.
What do you think?
Woohoo, very nice.
It's very cool, Bateman, but that's nothing. What do you think?
Nice.
To be fair though, Ferrus before the Heresy is undeniably a brilliant warrior, a craftsman, and a genius commander. In fact, he's often regarded as one of the greatest military minds amongst the Primarchs. Even Rabute Guilliman reflects that Ferrus Manus was one of the few select brothers, alongside Sanguinius, Leman, Russ, and Dorn, who he thought could be trusted to withstand any catastrophe and overcome almost any foe. As Guilliman states in No Fear, Ferrus Manus and the Iron Hands were always the fourth of the Dauntless Few. With any one of those key four, Dorn, Russ, Manus, or Sanguinius, Guilliman always claimed he could win any war, outright, against any foe. Even in extremis, the Ultramarines could compact with any one of those four allies and take down any foe. It was a primary theoretical. In any doomsday scenario that faced the Imperium, Guilliman could play it out to a practical win, provided he could rely on any one of those four. And of them, Manus was the key, implaceable. And most of the Primarchs echo this sentiment. But it's honestly kind of hilarious, Ferrus spends most of his actual appearances in canon being stubborn, angry, and making very questionable decisions. Yet after his death, the rest of the Primarchs proceed to glaze him into the stratosphere. Time and time again, we're told he's one of the Imperium's greatest generals, an unmatched strategist, and one of the most dependable Primarchs in the entire Imperium. The problem is that while Ferrus possessed all of these qualities, one of the recurring themes of his character is that he often allowed his temper and pride to override his judgment. Unfortunately for Ferrus, those flaws would follow him directly into the opening stages of the Horus Hersey, where a single reckless decision would ultimately cost him his life. But let's not get ahead of ourselves, people. Because Ferrus Manus starts the Heresy by immediately getting knocked out by Fulgrim. As before the Heresy even began, Fulgrim approached Ferrus Manus and attempted to lure him to Horus's cause. Ferrus was so enraged by the proposal that he attacked his brother on the spot. A short duel followed, during which Ferrus shattered Fireblade, the sword he had gifted Fulgrim years earlier. Despite that, Fulgrim escaped after rendering Fulgrim unconscious. But still, Horus's betrayal was revealed, and the Iron Hands were one of the first Loyalist legions called to Istvan. Given the distance and anger of Ferrus Manus, the Iron Hands only took the fastest vessels from their fleet and departed with only the veterans of their legion, numbering around 40,000 Marines, traveling as fast as they could ahead of their main force. But what's really interesting is that in the aftermath of Horus's betrayal, Ferrus Manus essentially became the acting War Master. As Dropside Massacre states, "The command is mine," said Ferrus. "I have signaled Terra claiming it. Dorn, on behalf of the Emperor, has ratified it. No other has disputed it or claimed it. The prosecution of this matter is mine."
You're not that guy, pal. Trust me. You're not that guy.
Ortha simulates his Primarch's words. The signal from Terra was clear. All forces and means are to be used in ending Horus's rebellion and bringing him to justice. Command of that task means command of all those assets. Ferrus Manus is now the de facto field commander of the military forces of the Imperium. All of the Iron Hands reach that same realization within a nanosecond of each other. None say anything. Their stillness speaks for them. This is not a Legion command gathering. They are about to help forge the shape of a war against the former War Master of mankind. So just like this excerpt states, Ferrus is effectively given command of the entire Loyalist response to Horus's rebellion, and his first major decision, launch a direct assault on Horus on Isstvan 5. You know, he could have simply blockaded them, or encircled them, or even ran a prolonged campaign to wear down the Sons of Horus, Death Guard, Emperor's Children, and World Eaters. But nope, Ferrus Manus has to straight up Leroy Jenkins himself into a frontal assault. What's even funnier about this situation is that Alfarius and Omegon, you know, two traitor Primarchs, actually tried to warn the Loyalists through an astropathic message, as seen in the book Dropside Massacre. The distribution of forces by Horus implies that he is baiting this attack. No doubt he intends striking the rear of an attacking force with the so far absent warships. To plunge into such a prepared ambush is insanity. Ferrus must see this. A strategy of isolation, blockade, force degrading, and a prolonged siege is the only method that will end in anything other than great loss. I am not, and ever have been, close enough to Ferrus that my voice would make him deviate from a course of action. You and I have in some ways differed on many matters, but I believe you will agree with me on this. He will listen to you, or you and Vulcan. We must stop this. So that's Alfarius' message to Corvus Corax. And Ferrus' response, well, it goes like this, also seen in the book Dropside Massacre. This is Ferrus Manus to Alfarius. No, we act now. We burn this treachery to its ashes, and then we scour the ashes for those who might follow. No mercy, no hesitation, no respite. End of transmission sequence. Ferrus, that's not much of a rebuttal there, buddy. Later on in that same book, both Corvus Corax and Vulcan attempt to talk some sense into the soon-to-be Headless Wonder. Tell me what you would have us do, says Ferrus, and Ma'un can hear the anger just under the iron layer of control. Wait, says Vulcan, encircle, blockade. Then what? Offer terms, wait for surrender? This is Horus, and Mortarion and the rest. You think they will surrender? You think they have not prepared for a siege as well as any attack? Their ships are returning. You have seen the reports. They gather forces either to break a blockade or to strike us in the back as we assault. We must attack and attack now. Time allows for no other course of action. Is that the only reason, brother? Asks Corax. Ferrus looks at him. What do you mean? There is wisdom in what you say, says Vulcan. Your insight and strategic calculation of war is undoubted, but there is more here than calculation for all of us. Ferrus looks between the other two Primarchs. There is a hunted look to his face now. This is not just an act of war, says Corax, it is personal. And that's really the problem with Ferrus Manus. He isn't making a purely strategic decision here. He's angry, and it's understandably so. He wants Fulgrim dead. He wants Horus dead. He wants revenge for his brother's betrayal. And so, down to Isstvan 5 he goes. Now to Ferrus' credit, he's an absolute monster during this battle. Just like Corax and Vulcan, he tears through the traitor lines. In fact, the Iron Hand's assault is so successful that they nearly break the enemy before the second wave arrives, as Horus himself observes in the book Dropside Massacre. Ferris's first wave will have breached the fortress within 20. They have us on the sword point. He smiles as he looks at the screen feeds and tactical displays. There is a sadness in the expression, sadness and admiration. Why could you not see the truth, my brothers? If they breach the fortress and get inside before the second wave deploys, I know, Mal, I know. So the assault was working. The problem is that Ferris has walked directly into a trap.
It's a trap!
As the Alpha Legion, Night Lords, Word Bearers, and Iron Warriors reveal their treachery and attack from the rear, trapping the Loyalists between two armies, and turning the battle into an absolute massacre. As we also see in the book Dropside Massacre, he looks at the spheres of fire forming and bursting above Istvan 5. They had been wrong. All of them who had looked at the situation and judged and decided. Ferris Manus, Corax, Vulcan, all of their advisors and officers wrong. And now they were dying for their failure, and their legions with them. Horus had not made a mistake. He had not left an opening. He had invited them to enact their own execution. The consequences for the Loyalist forces were catastrophic, to say the least. Over 200,000 Loyalist Space Marines became casualties, and 3 Loyalist legions were utterly shattered. The Iron Hands lost 35% of their entire legion. The Salamanders suffered approximately 97% casualties of their legion, and the Raven Guard lost around 94%. All in all, it's not exactly the greatest look. So, where does that leave Ferris? Well, Ferris really does next to nothing throughout the Heresy, because you know he dies in the very first battle. Despite constant statements that he is one of the Imperium's greatest generals, strategists, and commanders, we never actually get to see that brilliance in action. Instead, we see him allow his emotions and desire for revenge blind him into launching a suicidal attack that multiple Primarchs, including 2 traitor Primarchs, explicitly warned him against. That decision ultimately costs him his life and shatters 3 Loyalist legions in a single battle. Sure, Ferris didn't know he was going to be betrayed, but Alfarius literally warned him that Horus might be setting up a trap, and that attacking immediately may not be the greatest idea. Ferris hears these warnings and charges in anyways. Because of that, drumroll please, I think Ferris Manus deserves our first fraud grade. Yep, I'm sorry 10th Legion fans, but Ferris Manus really just doesn't do anything, and the actions and choices he does have in the Heresy just simply suck.
Come on over here. Come on over here. No, you flipped me off. Come on, coward. No. Come on. You're not an intellectual. You're a fake and a fraud.
He accomplishes almost nothing in the Heresy, and his single biggest decision ends up being actively detrimental to the entire Loyalist war effort. You could literally make the argument that the Imperium would have been better off if Ferris had died fighting Fulgrim in their first duel. Imagine Vulcan or Corax taking command. They probably wouldn't have walked right into the Istvan 5 trap. So, once again, I'm sorry Iron Hand fans, but your boy just kinda sucked during the Horus Heresy. Or at least for that one battle we saw him in. I hope the headless ghost of Ferris Manus doesn't come to haunt me tonight. Next, we have the Ultra Smurf himself, Rabute Guilliman, Lord of Ultramar and the Primarch of the Ultramarines. Guilliman from the get-go is already one of the most successful Primarchs in the entire Imperium. He commanded one of the largest legions, ruled one of the most prosperous regions of space, and transformed the 500 worlds into what was effectively an empire within an empire, which really set him and his legion up for success. As described in Horus Hersey Book 5, Tempest, the realm of Ultramar, forged by the brilliant strategic mind of the Primarch Rabute Guilliman and the martial prowess of his 13th Legion, the Ultramarines. Ultramar was the jewel of the Imperium's border realms. Over 500 worlds torn from the grip of unspeakable Xenos empires and the despots of Old Night. 2 centuries of disciplined and masterfully planned campaigning since the rediscovery of Rabute Guilliman had won the Ultramarines Legion an industrial base which rivaled any of the ancient strongholds at the Imperium's core. and this vast industrial complex supported one of the largest armies in the Imperial war machine, providing men and resources for the hundreds of regiments of the Exertus Imperialis raised across Ultramar, as well as the 13th Legion itself, one of the largest of all the Space Marine legions. So right from the onset, Guilliman is working with several advantages that few of his brothers can match, and due to these advantages, the Ultramarines numbered roughly 250,000 Marines, making them the largest legion in the entire Imperium, while also the 500 worlds gave them an industrial and logistical base rivaling entire sectors of Imperial space. But raw numbers only tell part of the story. What truly makes Guilliman dangerous was his mind and warp ability. Unlike Primarchs such as Russ or Angron, who often relied on instinct or martial prowess, Guilliman excelled at processing vast amounts of information all at once. So truthfully, his greatest weapon was his ability to understand entire wars, economies, supply networks, populations, and campaigns all at the same time. A perfect example of this comes from the book Lord of Shadows, when Corvus Corax retells testing Guilliman through a series of wargames. After he pestered me about it for weeks, I relented and played a series of wargames against Guilliman. In the first game, he learned the hard way that no retreat, no surrender is a pointless boast, not a sound tactical doctrine. In the second game, I created effective resistance from units he considered too depleted to be a threat. In the third game, I rallied the local population as informants, agitators, and guerrilla fighters. He saw a distinction between combatant and non-combatant that I did not at the time. You ran to perfection on Guilliman? Why is this the first time I'm hearing about it? Because I didn't. From the fourth game onwards, he had my mark and beat me every single time. He learns fast and takes a broad view. While I was freeing one planet from tyranny, he was already building an empire of hundreds. Many of the Primarchs are brilliant, but Guilliman seems to be beyond that. His warp ability allows him to absorb an absurd amount of information at an astonishing rate. It's one of the main reasons he became such an efficient ruler and strategist. So of course, with the largest legion, 500 plus worlds backing him up, and a mind that can juggle millions of things at once, Guilliman must have started in the perfect position. Right, guys? Right?
The lad deserves to enjoy his final hours.
Well, at the beginning of the Horus Heresy, Guilliman found himself exactly where Horus wanted him, far away from the main conflict. Horus had deliberately sent the Ultramarines to the Verdinian system, ensuring that the largest legion in the Imperium would be unable to react when the rebellion began. By the time the news of treachery had spread, Guilliman was already badly out of position and would spend much of the early heresy trying to recover from the disasters engineered by Horus and Lorgar. The first and greatest of these disasters was Calth. While the Ultramarines gathered their forces at Calth for what they thought was the next leg of the Great Crusade against a massive Orc empire, the Wordbearers launched one of the most devastating surprise attacks in Imperial history. You know, outside of the Dropsite Massacre. This betrayal crippled the 13th Legion and very nearly killed Guilliman himself when he was blown into space. But bonus points to Guilliman, he did survive this attack, and even killed dozens of Wordbearers helmetless in space. Yeah, that's pretty damn badass. Later during the Battle of Calth, as seen in the book Know No Fear, he fought Corfarion and managed to rip out one of the old priest's hearts. But even with these small victories, the losses at Calth were horrible for the 13th Legion. As Horus Hersey Book 5 Tempest states, the Ultramarines recorded their casualties at the moment when Guilliman and the remains of the 13th Legion departed Calth at 119,400 and 2,200. Legiones Astartes fallen in combat, with a further 28,392 rendered combat incapable by battle injuries and trauma. Those casualty numbers are pretty damn insane. Nearly 120,000 Ultramarines were killed outright, with another 28,000 unable to continue fighting throughout the Heresy. In total, that's 60% of the entire Legion's pre-Heresy strength. In a single battle, folks. Yeah, a single battle. And yet somehow, Guilliman still managed to turn the Battle of Calth into a victory. Although the surface of the world was devastated because the word bearers, no surprise, destroyed their sun, beginning the infamous Underground War, the Ultramarines still managed to rally and inflict devastating losses on the word bearers, as half of their fleet was destroyed, including major capital ships such as the Infidus Imperator and Destiny's Hand, and all of the word bearers who had taken part in the battle were either killed, wounded, or stranded on the planet for the remainder of the war, which comes around to 50,000 of the 17th Legion. Considering the scale of the ambush, the fact that Guilliman emerged with a functioning legion at all is a testament to his leadership. Unfortunately though, for the Papa Smurf, things only got worse from there. Following the Battle of Calth, the Shadow Crusade began, where the Word Bearers and World Eaters tore through Ultramar and the 500 worlds. Entire planets were burned, populations massacred, and infrastructure, painstakingly built over centuries, was reduced to rubble. The jewel of the Imperium suddenly found itself fighting for survival. To Guilliman's credit, he didn't collapse under this pressure. Instead, he rallied what remained of his forces and launched a counteroffensive against the traitors. However, this campaign ultimately culminated in the Battle of Nuceria, the homeworld of Angron, where Guilliman made one of the more questionable decisions in the early part of the Heresy, attempting to fight both Lorgar and Angron at the same time. And as you might expect, that didn't exactly go great for the Blueberry. At the height of the battle, Lorgar completed the ritual that elevated Angron to demonhood, transforming the already terrifying and angry Primarch into a servant of the blood god, Khorne. The results are pretty predictable, as described in the book Betrayer. Angron himself still fought Guilliman, standing above the kneeling Ultramarine. Had he even noticed the storm of blood streaming from the sky in a red torrent? Sparks sprayed from Herbute's raised gauntlets as he struggled to ward off blow after blow. He was beaten, he was down. Wounds painted him a palette of proud defeat. Even now his warriors were fighting to retrieve him. With a scarring around his armor and the sense of pain bleeding from his mind, Lorgar reckoned his brother would be lucky to ever walk again. And moments later, we get this. This time as Guilliman, rather than Russ, dragged himself clear, the World Eater staggered back himself, clawing at the ruin of his face and chest. He was tearing at his own armor and flesh, ripping it away in fistfuls, screaming a sound that no living thing should be able to make. Now, to be fair, in that fight, Guilliman does manage to wound Angron pretty severely, but that's about the nicest thing we can say about their fight. Strategically, Nuceria is a defeat. Guilliman fails to stop Angron's ascension, the world is utterly destroyed, and the traitor legions are both able to escape and leave the 500 worlds largely intact. So if we're being completely honest here folks, the opening stages of the Horus Heresy are pretty damn rough for Rabute Guilliman. His legion is gutted at Calth, Ultramar loses over 100 worlds during the Shadow Crusade, Angron ascends into a demon Primarch on his watch, Lorgar escapes, the Ruined Storm is formed, the World Eaters escape, and despite commanding the largest legion in the Imperium, Guilliman spends much of the early Heresy reacting to disasters rather than dictating events. Now, most of this isn't really his fault, but he did give in to his emotions and launch a haphazard attack on 2 traitor Primarchs while severely outnumbered, which could have resulted in his death and left the Ultramar system severely lacking in the leadership department. During the middle portion of the Heresy, Guilliman's greatest achievement wasn't winning some legendary duel or slaying a demon Primarch. It was keeping Ultramar alive, when almost everyone else thought the 500 worlds were already dead. Cut off from Terra by the Ruined Storm and unable to determine whether the Emperor still lived, Guilliman made the controversial decision to form Imperium Secundus. But unlike Horus, who sought power for himself, Guilliman never attempted to crown himself king. In fact, he initially tried to place the responsibility on Lionel Johnson before ultimately supporting Sanguinius as Lord Regent. Throughout the Imperium Secundus arc, Guilliman found himself constantly dealing with new problems. First, Alpha Legion assassination attempts, Then Conrad Kurz rampaging across Macragge, then like we discussed earlier, political disputes with the Lion, and most of all the difficult task of holding together what remained of the Loyalist cause within the Ultramar system. To really explain this, you guys have to imagine this. Imagine you're Roboute Guilliman. You're 10 feet or 12 feet tall, you're blonde, you got a chiseled jawline, and you got a six-pack. But besides that, your entire empire is scattered, unable to communicate with each other due to the ruin storm, and warp space travel is pretty much impossible. Imagine the insanity of trying to juggle the logistics from entire worlds when it's almost impossible to talk to them. And somehow Roboute Guilliman was keeping it all together. That in itself is a feat, far beyond what most Primarchs would be able to do. But as opposed to the earlier portion of the Horus Hersey, Guilliman did succeed. Eventually Guilliman, Sanguinius, and the Lion agreed to abandon Imperium Secundus and fight their way back towards Terra. The journey through the ruin storm was filled with demonic assaults, assassination attempts, and constant warfare. But Guilliman repeatedly demonstrated one of his greatest strengths: his ability to adapt and make rational decisions under pressure. Another often overlooked moment came during this journey through the ruin storm. As seen in the book, surprise surprise, ruin storm. At one moment, Guilliman acquires 2 Anathema blades, which, if you guys don't remember, are ritualistic daggers that are tainted by chaos and hold immense power through symbolic importance. Guilliman was almost tempted to study and experiment on these blades, to truly understand the enemy he was fighting. But realizing the danger posed by these chaos-tainted daggers, he ultimately chose to destroy them rather than risk following the same path that had corrupted Horus. On the surface, this seems like a relatively minor event, but it was actually one of the many ways the Ruinous Pantheon tested the Loyalist Primarchs during their journey through the Ruin Storm, as the other 2 Primarchs with him, the Lion and Sanguinius, were tested as well. The Lion was nearly manipulated into bombing Davin while Sanguinius was still on the planet, while Sanguinius was tempted by Madail, who promised to save his sons from the Red Thirst. Guilliman's trial, though, was much different from the other 2 Primarchs. Chaos attacked the very aspect of him that made him who he was, his mind. Guilliman is a planner and analyst, a statesman. His instincts is always to gather more information, understand the situation, and preserve every possible advantage. The Anathemas represented exactly that temptation. They were dangerous, but they were also valuable. They were weapons and knowledge, an insight into the enemy. Chaos attacked the aspect of him most vulnerable to corruption, his need to understand, and Guilliman still chose duty over temptation and knowledge. After the destruction of Davin and the collapse of the Ruin Storm, Guilliman immediately shifted back to what he did best: organization, logistics, and rebuilding. While Sanguinius raced ahead to Terra and Lion started bombing planets, Guilliman somehow managed to reconstruct enough of Ultramar's military infrastructure to assemble the single largest Loyalist relief fleet of the entire war. And then once that was complete, he immediately started pushing on Terra, fighting his way through the many worlds taken and defended by the Iron Warriors, as seen explicitly in the book Slaves to Darkness. Crade was a world on the boundary between the War Master's domain and the vengeful wrath of Ultramar. The warp storms that had for so long split the galaxy had guttered. The screaming tides that had blinded the Ultima Segmentum had dispersed, and with its ebb, the anger of Roboute Guilliman and every scrap of might he could call on had begun to move in the storm's wake. The Shadow Crusade of Lorgar and Angron had wounded them. The predations of the Night Haunter had bled them. But the Lord of Macragge had endured, and now his sons came in vengeance. Worlds held in the War Master's name had come under attack. Some had fallen, and the loyalty of others had begun to waver. All the while, words and rumors had come from the galactic south. First in whispers, then in scattered reports of retreat and disaster. The warriors of the 13th were coming. Across the path of this rising tide, the Iron Warriors stood. Worlds were burned, fortified, or reinforced. Traps were laid in the path of the enemy. For every advance they made, the forces of the false emperor paid, and paid again. But advance they did. So Guilliman was slowly advancing on Terra, retaking worlds occupied by the Iron Warriors who stood in his way. and this Vengeance fleet was absurdly large, as the End and the Death Part 3 states. Thiel knows it by heart. 3,200 principal vessels, most of them Grand Cruiser class or larger, supported by bulk carriers, war engine mass transports, and a flotilla of tenders. It contains most of Battlefleet Macragge, the Connor Squadron, the Sarah Manf Squadron, the Lux Ultramars Battle Group, the 3rd Vanguard Flotilla of the 500 Worlds, the Akluda 2nd Principal Fleet, the Minos Crucius Fast Attack, and the allied warships of the Shattered Legions. Lamiad lists each ship by name, and Guilliman lets him. The fleet translated from warp 8 days earlier via extra system Mandeville points, when it became evident that the solar realm was impassable, and has been slowly approaching the hem of the realm ever since on real space. Impellers in an assault-ready crescent formation 6,000 kilometers wide. Just stop and think about that for a second. This is after Calf. This is after losing nearly 150,000 Ultramarines in a single battle. This is after the Shadow Crusade, which devastated Ultramar. This is after the push on the Ruin Storm. And yet Guilliman still manages to muster a massive relief force of over 3,200 capital ships alongside other supporting vessels. The sheer logistical skill required to organize, supply, coordinate, and deploy a fleet of that size is so insane, guys. Even crazier, with the losses suffered at Calf and throughout the rest of the Heresy, Guilliman still ends the war with the largest legion. But what was even more important than organizing such a large relief force is the fact that Guilliman's advance directly influenced the outcome of the siege. Horus knew Guilliman was coming. The War Master understood that time was running out, and the approaching Loyalist armada was one of the primary reasons he was forced to lower the shields on the Vengeful Spirit and gamble everything on a final duel with the Emperor. Unfortunately though for Guilliman, fate denied him the chance to participate in the Siege of Terra. His fleet arrived only hours too late, stranded outside of Terra and the solar system until the Astronomicon was relit. Once it was restored, Guilliman finally reached the throne world and helped drive the remaining traitors from the solar system. In many ways, that perfectly summarizes Guilliman's role throughout the Heresy. He may not have had Dorn's walls, Sanguinius' sacrifice, or the Khan's heroics, but when the Imperium was falling apart, Guilliman was the one putting the pieces back together. So in order to correctly grade the blueberry, we need to weigh the pros and cons. For the cons, through no fault of his own, he was utterly devastated by the opening moments of the Heresy. The Wordbearers and their allies crippled the Ultramarines at Calth, trapped him behind the Ruin Storm, and effectively removed the largest legion in the Imperium for much of the war. Regardless of the reasons, the fact remains that Guilliman and the Ultramarines were absent from the Siege of Terra, the single most important battle of the entire Heresy. However, I don't think it's fair to hold that entirely against him. Unlike some of the Primarchs who actively made mistakes that damaged the Loyalist cause, Guilliman was placed in an almost unwinnable situation. The traitors specifically targeted him because they knew the Ultramarines represented the greatest concentration of Loyalist military power in the entire galaxy. Horus isolated him and set the Wordbearers to destroy him solely because he was arguably the biggest Loyalist threat to his rebellion. So those are the cons, and as you can tell, they're not that bad. As for the pros, Guilliman managed to stabilize Ultramar after the catastrophe at Calth and the destruction wrought by the Shadow Crusade, preventing one of humanity's greatest domains from collapsing completely into chaos. He maintained a functioning bastion of Imperial power while much of the galaxy burned. He, along with the Lion and Sanguinius, helped destroy the Ruin Storm, resisted the temptations of chaos, and most importantly, gathered an enormous relief force that fought their way through countless traitor-defended worlds on their drive towards Terra.
Put your needle in this tree and I'll give you such a do it.
Yeah? You and what army?
Would the defenders of the throne world have preferred him actually be present at Terra? Sure. But without Guilliman, there may not have been much of an Imperium to save. For those reasons, I can't justify giving him the same grade as Sanguinius or Dorn, as those Primarchs directly shaped the outcome of the war's most critical battles, but at the same time though, Guilliman accomplished far too much to be anything lower than a high-scoring grade. So I'm going to give Roboute Guilliman an A grade, placing him alongside Jekatai Khan. This grade may be a little bit controversial, but come on guys, without Guilliman, Horus would have nothing to fear. He would have taken all the time in the world and wouldn't have rushed haphazardly towards the throne world. If the Ultramarines and their Papa Smurf had been removed from the war, the 500 worlds would have collapsed. There would have been no Pharaoh's device to unite Sanguinius and the Lion.
And the right choice is the one that keeps us alive. It's always the same with you. It's like the first moments. It's whenever you're put to the test. Stop acting like you know the way ahead, like you know the rules. There are no rules, man. We're lost. No, man.
And the Loyalist war effort would have completely collapsed. The traitors could have taken their time, consolidated their power, and slowly forced Terra to concede. He may not have been in the thick of the fray, but Guilliman is definitely deserving of the A grade. Finally, we come to our last two Loyalist Primarchs, both from the Shattered Legions. Beginning with everyone's favorite, Vulcan, the Primarch of the Salamanders, the Great Smith, and the Lord of Drakes. Vulcan, of course, has one of the most painful and death-filled arcs of any Primarch during the Horus Heresy, and it all begins at Istvan 5. But before we get into the many times Vulcan has died throughout the Heresy, let's first cover the abilities and talents that allowed him to thrive, at least before he got captured by Conrad Kurz. Vulcan was first and foremost a master smith and creator. Even Perturabo, arguably the greatest engineer among the Primarchs, had immense respect for Vulcan's craftsmanship. As Perturabo states in Angels Exterminatus, his love of the forge encompasses all things, from crafting weapons to fashioning miniature wonders of artifice. But that one isn't working, asked Fulgrim. Then he's not as good as I heard. No, it was perfect, said Perturabo. It was damaged during the fighting at Fall. To add to that, all of the hammers Vulcan bore into battle were crafted with his own hands. Many contained secondary functions hard built into them. For example, one possessed a long-range teleportation device, while another could absorb and redirect incoming energy attacks. And hammers are only scratching the surface of the incredible weapons and relics Vulcan created throughout the Heresy. Outside of being a master craftsman, Vulcan also possessed perhaps the most absurd gift of all. He was a perpetual. While though pretty powerful as he literally can't die, unless you stab him with one of the greatest MacGuffins I've seen in my life, this unique ability turned him into the galaxy's biggest punching bag throughout the Heresy. No matter what wound he received, he would return. Shot, stabbed, burned, dismembered, it didn't matter. Vulcan would eventually regenerate and come back. And as all immortal characters tend to do in 40k, Vulcan dies a lot. And when I mean a lot, I mean a lot, guys. He dies an extreme amount. It's like the writers saw Vulcan and they realized, Vulcan's a perpetual. How do I show that to my reader? Ah, I know, I'll kill him 12 times in my novel. That'll really show him. But where does Vulcan begin? Well, he begins the Horus Heresy at the Dropsite Massacre. And like we discussed in the Ferrus Manus section, he was present alongside Manus and Corvus Corax during the Istvan atrocity. In fact, Vulcan attempted to convince Ferrus not to launch a direct assault, and instead establish a blockade to encircle and starve the traitors. But as we all know, Ferrus didn't listen. Once on the surface, Vulcan would find himself facing down the Death Guard Primarch, Mortarion, and the two Primarchs would clash in one of the lesser-known duels throughout the Heresy, as seen in the book Dropsite Massacre. Ursus looks up. It is Vulcan. The two Primarchs are eye to eye. close enough to embrace. The hammer and the scythe of each are locked together. Vulcan's armor is streaked with half-dissolved lacquer. Corrosive moisture beads on the drake scales of his cloak. Vulcan twists free and strikes. The hammer blow lands with force enough to crush mountains and shatter tanks, but the Death Lord is standing, twisting the scythe free into a cut that thrums the air like a rotor blade. Scythe strikes Hammerhead once, twice, and a third time. The two Primarch brothers are still locked together, movements too fast to read or follow. Ursus hears a rotor cannon open up nearby. Here's the rallying shouts pass from mouth to mouth and vox to vox, as Vulcan's honor company pours in to meet the Death Guard. Sons of Vulcan stand. While we never get a definitive conclusion to this duel, the fact remains that Vulcan was going toe-to-toe with Mortarion for a significant period of time. Unfortunately, the wider battle would prove disastrous for the Loyalist legions. The bulk of the Salamander's legion was annihilated by the Iron Warriors' nuclear bombardments once the trap was sprung. Vulcan, thanks to his perpetual nature, survived, but his legion was utterly destroyed. And by the end of the battle, as seen in Horus Hersey Book 2 Massacre, the 18th Legion was all but destroyed. Although full records are impossible to verify in the aftermath of the Dropside Massacre, it is believed a force of around 83,000 Space Marines went with their Primarch to Istvan V. The losses of which during that deadly action were almost total, rated by some sources as high as 98%. Vulcan did survive, but found himself surrounded by hundreds and hundreds of enemy Marines, from the Iron Warriors and Night Lords. Fighting until he believed death was inevitable, he was eventually overwhelmed, beaten unconscious, and taken prisoner by the worst person imaginable, Conrad Kurz. And thus begins one of the most miserable stretches any Primarch experiences during the entire Heresy. As Kurz, seeing an opportunity to torment his brother, Kurz subjected Vulcan to months of torture, killing him in various and creative ways. Decapitating him, ripping out his throat with a fork, impaling him, dismembering him, riddling him with bolter rounds, leaving him trapped in an exhaust shaft of a starship engine, and even casting him naked into the void of space. Every single time, Kurz failed though. Eventually, frustration that he could not break Vulcan physically led Kurz to attempt to break him mentally. Through chaos sorcery and endless trials, Kurz sought to prove that Vulcan was no better than he was. Again and again, Vulcan was forced to watch as innocent people died. Yet despite all the trials Kurz put him through, Vulcan refused to surrender who he was. Enraged and annoyed that he couldn't break Vulcan, Kurz finally decided to settle matters personally, forcing Vulcan through a labyrinth designed by Perturabo, and at the center lay Dawnbringer, Vulcan's personal hammer. And after reclaiming said hammer, Vulcan delivered one of the coldest lines I've seen in my Gal life, and he definitely gets bonus points for this. I lowered the weapon and let the weight of its head pull the haft down until my hand was wrapped around the very end of the grip. But you're forgetting one thing. Kurz leaned in, as if eager to hear my words. He believed that he had me, that I would never escape his trap. He was wrong. What's that, brother? It's also a hammer. The blow caught him across the chin. A savage upswing that took Kurz off his feet and put him on the ground again with the sheer force of the impact. Yeah, that's absolutely iconic. What's very interesting though is that Vulcan still chose not to kill Kurz. Now, you could totally mark that as a negative to his overall score. Kurz would go on to kill countless more people and continue causing chaos across the Imperium. But people, context does matter. Kurz was actively trying to manipulate Vulcan into murdering him. He was trying to pull Vulcan down to his level, as Kurz himself admits. In the book, Vulcan Lives. Blood and saliva flecked Kurz's armor, spat from his still grinning mouth. Yes, he choked at me, yes.
Harder, Daddy. What?
So wretched, I wanted to kill him, to end his suffering and take some measure of vengeance for all the suffering he had caused me and my sons. Come on, Kurz's eyes were pleading, and I realized he wanted this. Ever since Karatan, he had wanted this. Not every chink of weakness I had seen in this place was finged. Kurz truly did loathe himself. So much so that he wanted it to end. If I killed him, he would have everything he wanted. death and a means of bringing me down to his despicable level. That's the real key point there. Killing Kurz would have given him exactly what he wanted, while forcing Vulcan to abandon the values he had spent months suffering to preserve. And ironically, Kurz surviving would later contribute to Guilliman, Sanguinius, and the Lion realizing that the Emperor still lived, abolishing Imperium Secundus, and then making their way towards Terra. Man, isn't that just a crazy domino effect of decisions? Using his hammer, Dawnbringer, Vulcan was teleported across the galaxy, and surprise, surprise, he ended up in the atmosphere of Macragge. This promptly burned him up entirely during re-entry, and his charred remains were eventually recovered by the Ultramarines, who initially believed they had discovered little more than a grotesque statue, as virtually all living tissue had been burned away. Over the following days, though, the corpse began regenerating. To the horror and amazement of the Ultramarines apothecaries, Vulcan slowly returned to life.
Were you killed? Sadly, yes. But I lived.
Unfortunately for him, though, he didn't come back quite right. The endless torture inflicted by Kurz and him literally burning up in the atmosphere had shattered his mind, leaving him violent, incoherent, and attacking anyone unfortunate enough to get near him. This eventually led to another confrontation with Conrad Kurz, who had snuck aboard the Invincible Reason and then made it down to the surface of Guilliman's homeworld. There, the two would fight across the city, where Vulcan would die multiple times yet again. And here's where we reach one of the perpetual side plots, the John Grammaticus side plot. Yes, John Grammaticus is in this book. And to keep things as short as possible, John Grammaticus is tasked by the Cabal to give Conrad Kurz the Fulgurite, who the Cabal wishes to kill Vulcan with it. And for those wondering what the hell the Fulgurite is, well folks, the Fulgurite is a literal frozen shard of the Emperor's power. Like I said, the biggest MacGuffin I've seen in my life. But instead of doing this, Eldrith Uthran hijacks this mission and tells John Grammaticus to stab Vulcan with the weapon to help Vulcan regain his memories, and so, listening to the Eldar Farseer, he does this. But instead of popping right back up, Vulcan permanently dies, or so it appears. Now I swear every single time I talk about Vulcan, I end up talking about his resurrection arc, and the book Deathfire. And every single time, I'm yet again reminded on how stupid that book is.
Shut the fuck up! Know your fucking place, trash!
Yes, it's written by Nick Kime, who you all know I have a personal vendetta against. In this book, Vulcan's corpse is eventually returned to Nocturne, his homeworld. And there, through what can only be described as a series of incredibly bizarre prophetic events and sacrificial rituals, which includes Artillus Newman, the first captain of the 18th Legion, jumping headfirst into a volcano, which somehow works, mind you. It revives Vulcan back from the dead. Like I say every single time I talk about this, how the hell is this canon? It makes no sense. Following his resurrection, Vulcan embarks on a long journey towards Terra, guided by mysterious visions, Eldrith Uthran, and what is essentially the Emperor working behind the scenes. Vulcan travels through the webway, fights the Dark Eldar, smashes a bizarre mechanical imitation of Ferrus Manus, battles demons, and ultimately slays a great unclean one. Eventually, Vulcan reached Terra and was brought before the Emperor himself. Now, Vulcan, I will admit, spends a good majority of the siege locked away in the Emperor's basement, and he doesn't really partake in most of the fighting. But, and of course there's gonna be a but, even without leaving the dungeons, Vulcan's decisions, inventions, and performance is still one of the best in the Heresy. First and foremost, when Vulcan returned to Terra, he is entrusted with perhaps the single most important contingency plan in the Siege of Terra. Acting under the Emperor's guidance, Vulcan forges and maintains the Talisman of Seven Hammers. The Emperor reveals that Vulcan's existence has always been leading towards this moment, and that weapon was designed as the ultimate dead man hand switch. If Horus won and Chaos claimed Terra, Vulcan would activate the Talisman and deny the Ruinous Pantheon their ultimate prize, as the Emperor explains in the book Old Earth. "No, my son," said the Emperor sadly, the master of mankind standing before him now. not to deny it to Horus, but to Chaos, and to strike a blow against their forces, the like of which they will never recover from. To win the war, you would sacrifice Terra. If Terra falls and Horus takes it, then we have lost anyway, and all of mankind will suffer. Vulcan wrenched the talisman from his neck and reached out with it towards the throne. A small circular aperture presented itself, and without further hesitation, he pressed the talisman into it. In the moment of connection, Vulcan saw a sea of flame rise up to engulf the Tower of Hegemon, to swallow the Tower of Heroes, and all the mighty spires of the palace. It spread, this conflagration, within his mind, sweeping across the Pan-Pacific, Yursh, High Brazel, Ind, and Norda Frick, to every region until nothing remained but ash. The talisman would magnify the power of the throne to unleash Cataclysm. So right off the bat, Vulcan creates arguably the single most important weapon for the Loyalists during the siege. And beyond that, he is personally tasked with guarding the Emperor and the Eternity Gate. Vulcan retreated from his father and the throne. His eyes went to the portal. It would fail. His father had seen it. And Vulcan knew what lay beyond. He stepped back until he stood in the shadow of the Eternity Gate and held Ur Dracul across his body in both hands, an eternal guardian. Let them come. And soon enough, they do. We next see Vulcan during the book Fury of Magnus, where Magnus the Red and a force of 1,000 sons have infiltrated the Imperial dungeon in an attempt to reach the Emperor. There, Magnus and Vulcan square off in their first duel, as Vulcan intercepts a direct psychic strike thrown from Magnus at the Emperor. The two then engage in a brutal duel, with Vulcan ultimately gaining the upper hand. But yeah, Vulcan defeats Magnus while protecting the Emperor on the Golden Throne. And most Primarchs would be very happy with that accomplishment alone. But of course, Magnus just comes back, and even stronger than ever as a demon Primarch. And the two fight again, this time in the book Echoes of Eternity. Now, some context for this fight is Magnus is in the Webway, conducting a ritual designed to weaken the Emperor's wards on the Webway and undermine Terra's defenses. Vulcan is dispatched by the Emperor to stop him once again. What follows is one of the most ridiculous endurance feats in the entire Heresy. Initially, Magnus fights from behind psychic defenses and illusions, forcing Vulcan to batter his way through layer after layer of sorcery. But once these barriers are broken, Magnus attempts every conceivable method of killing his brother. He decapitates him, burns him alive, drains his blood, suffocates him, tears him apart with psychic attacks, and repeatedly annihilates his body. But nothing works. Every single time, Vulcan just gets right back up and returns from death. Eventually, Magnus grows so desperate that he attempts something far more extreme. He literally tries to erase Vulcan from existence at an atomical level, as seen in the book Echoes of Eternity. Physically, Vulcan came apart at the biological seams. His black skin ruptured with holes that siphon light. These bloodless ruptures spread through his bones, his organs, his armor. What remained of his skin ignited, then blew away in an instant later as ash in the Webway's sourceless breeze. A partially articulated skeleton bound together by disintegrating tendons staggered back as its eyeballs caught fire. And yet, he couldn't understand how the man in front of him could still be on his feet. He couldn't believe this flayed, immolated thing, being erased from existence, endured all this, and still swung its hammer. He couldn't lose here. He couldn't die. He couldn't. So Magnus, even with his clever plans, elaborate strategies, and psychic might, still couldn't beat Vulcan, which is essentially if you don't succeed the first, second, third, fourth, or 50th time, try again. Yet despite how funny that sounds, the consequences of this victory are massive for the Loyalist side. Had Magnus completed his ritual, he would have further weakened the Emperor, and it's very possible that Magnus could have found a way through the Webway itself, resulting in the siege ending very differently and possibly quite earlier. But that is still not the end of Vulcan's Siege of Terra run, because eventually he does make it back to the throne room. And upon doing so, he is greeted with the news that the Vengeful Spirit has lowered its void shields, and the Emperor himself is preparing to lead an assault on the vessel to kill the arch-traitor. While Sanguinius, Dorn, and Valdor accompany the Emperor on this assault, Vulcan, though, is ordered to stay behind to guard the Golden Throne, which would soon be occupied by Malcador the Sigillite. Should the traitors breach the palace, Vulcan was instructed to activate the Talisman of 7 Hammers. Shortly after this, Vulcan would encounter the Perpetual Hit Squad, Alanis Pearson, John Chromaticus, and the rest of the Dirty Bunch. This is another part of the Perpetual side plot, and pretty much their whole goal was to make it to the Emperor and convince him that his plan was wrong. Now at this point, the Perpetuals think Horus is going to become the Dark King, but the Emperor himself is actually the theoretical Dark King. But that's beside the point. Even as the Custodes pressure him to kill them, Vulcan decides to let them live, and instead to contain them until the Emperor returns. As the siege reaches its climax, and the Emperor battles Horus aboard the Vengeful Spirit, the traitor forces push ever and ever closer to the throne room. With Terra dipping into the warp, time, space, and the literal dimensions of the palace have begun to change, as the traitors find themselves teleporting into the Sanctum Imperialis, allowing them to get even closer to the throne room. In this moment, believing all hope is lost, Vulcan begins the activation of the Talisman of 7 Hammers. At that very last moment, Vulcan is convinced to stop, as Actia's transmission spreads across Terra, confirming that the Emperor still lives, and is actively fighting Horus. But what is important here is not just what he does, but what he chooses not to do. And that's kind of a major theme of Vulcan during the Siege of Terra. There are multiple irreversible points where Vulcan could have ended everything. Even earlier than that, Vulcan demonstrates restraint when encountering the Perpetual Hit Squad. Rather than executing them on suspicion alone, he opts for containment, as seen in The End and the Death Part 1. I will not commit murder on behalf of the Imperium, says Vulcan, especially without evidence of actual crime. The fact that they are an unknown quantity, and we are made uncomfortable by them, is not sufficient. He turns to Hassan. Go have the Sentinels secure them, Chosen One, he says. That singular decision matters far more than it first appears, because Pearson ultimately becomes part of a chain of events leading to Horus's final downfall. Vulcan's restraint there indirectly preserves one of the key pieces needed to end the war and save the Emperor. For those who don't know what the hell I'm talking about, Alanis Pearson is the one who brings the anathema to the Emperor. This anathema was the first weapon used to kill another man, so the symbolic power within this blade is absolutely insane. And the Emperor then uses this blade to channel his full psychic might into Horus, which kills the arch-traitor's body and soul, ending the Horus Heresy. What another cool domino effect. So when it comes to scoring Vulcan, he has quite the resume. He creates the Talisman of 7 Hammers, acts as the final physical barrier protecting the Golden Throne, engages and ultimately stops Magnus not once, but twice. He decides not to execute Alanis Pearson and the Perpetual Hit Squad. So while he isn't the loudest, or most visibly dominant Primarch during the siege, Vulcan is one of the most structurally important. Oh yeah, I kind of forgot, Alanis Pearson is the individual who talks the Emperor down from ascending to the Dark King. So yeah, without Vulcan, and his order not to kill Alanis Pearson and the Perpetual Hit Squad, the Dark King may have actually ascended to become the 5th Chaos God, and the galaxy would have been utterly destroyed. So I'm going to give Vulcan an S grade, alongside Sanguinius and Dorn. This one may be a little controversial, but I think the facts clearly define that Vulcan's role in the siege was incredibly important, and without him, humanity may have been doomed. Finally, we come to our last Loyalist Primarch. Oh yeah, you guessed it, it's the emo bird boy, Corvus Corax, the Raven Lord and Primarch of the Raven Guard. Just like Vulcan and Ferrus Manus, he is the final member of the Shattered Legions. And just like always, let's talk about Corvus Corax's abilities and military genius before getting into the Esteban 5 atrocity. First off, Corvus Corax is known for being a master of stealth. Of course, he even possesses a unique ability called Shadow Walk, which is not really true invisibility, rather it is a psychic ability that clouds the minds of observers, resulting in them not noticing him. even while he is directly in their line of sight. And just like their Primarch, the Raven Guard excel at stealth, infiltration, sabotage, and guerrilla warfare. But that didn't really help them out during the beginning stages of the Istvan V atrocity. Here, just like Vulcan and Ferrus Manus, Corvus Corax started the Heresy knee-deep in disaster. And just like we discussed with Vulcan, Corax attempted to convince Ferrus Manus not to launch a reckless invasion of the planet, but ultimately joined the assault regardless. And let me tell you folks, Corvus Corax performed beautifully during the beginning of the battle, carving through traitors like there was no tomorrow. Like we get this excerpt from the book The First Heretic. The Primarch of the Raven Guard turned with an inhuman cry, letting the thrumming wing blades affixed to his smoking jetpack slice out with their killing edges. Wordbearers tumbled away in droves, shredded into lumps of armored flesh. The claws followed, rending through any of the Great Warriors unlucky enough to be within range of the Warlord's landing. Once he was in motion, Corax never slowed. He was a blur of charcoal armor and black blades, carving, chopping, dismembering without effort, mutilating with the barest movement, butchering with an ease that bellied his ferocity. Last cannon fire rained towards the Primarch as the Iron Warriors turned their turrets on the gravest threat in range. The Wordbearers caught in the net of streaming fire were sliced apart as surely as the ones killed by Corax's claws. But the beams themselves flashed aside from the Primarch's armor, never striking it straight on, leaving savage burn scars without once penetrating. The voices of dying Wordbearers became a conflicting chorus over the Vox. Besides wiping out a ton of Wordbearers, he also killed a handful of the Galvor back, and in addition to that, even fought Lorgar Aurelian and came dangerously close to killing him. In fact, the Raven Lord had impaled the Wordbearer's Primarch with his lightning claws and was about to deal the final killing stroke before Conrad Kurz unfortunately intervened, forcing Corvus Corax to retreat. The rest of his legion, though, would not fare nearly as well. According to Horus Hersey Book 2, Massacre, the Raven Guard were effectively annihilated as a fighting force. When the Raven Guard committed to the Istvan V drop, they did so in numbers approaching their full strength, with all assets, both surface and space, borne in attendance. The events of the Battle of Gate 42 had left the Raven Guard as the smallest of the legions, but they would be operating alongside 6 of their brother legions, or so they had every reason to believe. The truth, as described elsewhere in this account, was otherwise. The Raven Guard were to lose tens of thousands of legionaries during the betrayal that was the Istvan V Dropsite Massacre, and by the end of the 98 days that have followed, can muster but a fraction of their former strength. Leaving aside the unknown numbers operating alone in the outer darkness, the Raven Guard must now number barely 4,000, including those dispatched to garrison Deliverance. So sadly, just like the Iron Hands and the Salamanders, Corvus Corax's legion was utterly devastated. The remaining survivors, including Corax, spent the next 98 days waging a brutal guerrilla campaign on Istvan V, before eventually escaping thanks to the arrival of a small Raven Guard fleet, who saved the remaining survivors as they were about to be annihilated by Angron and the World Eaters. After fleeing the Istvan system, Corax returned to Terra, seeking answers and, more importantly, a way to save his legion. Though he was denied a direct audience with the Emperor due to the Webway project, the Emperor nonetheless sensed his son's desperation.
Please, 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 please,
and psychically guided him towards a solution. Through visions and hidden knowledge, Corax was directed towards a secret laboratory. There he recovered the foundational genetic material used in the creation of the Primarchs, the Magna Mater. With this priceless knowledge, Corax believed he had found a way to rebuild his legion in a fraction of the normal time. Once back on his homeworld of Deliverance, Corax put the recovered genetic material to work. Alongside his chief apothecary, Vincent Six, he began rapidly creating new Raven Guard Marines. In only a matter of weeks, roughly 500 battle-ready Space Marines had been created. And for the first time since Istvan, the Raven Guard actually had hope. And then, the Alpha Legion happened. In one of the most devastating acts of sabotage during the entire Heresy, the Alpha Legion operatives, who had infiltrated the 19th Legion during the Istvan V assault and had hidden amongst their ranks, now struck. as they sought to acquire the genetic material gifted by the Emperor. Working alongside a renegade Mechanica Magos, they introduced a warp-tainted mutagen derived from demonic blood into the Primarch project, which resulted in many of the new recruits emerging horribly mutated, bearing scales, horns, fangs, tails, and other grotesque physical deformities. This is definitely by far one of the biggest negatives when it comes to grading Corvus Corax. Yes, the Alpha Legion are the greatest infiltrators in the galaxy. Yes, Omegon himself was involved, but this genetic material was the strategic asset. It was the single greatest hope of the entire 19th Legion. If there was one thing Corvus Corax needed to guard with absolute paranoia, it was the Emperor's genetic research. And somehow the Alpha Legion still got their hands on it. So just as the Raven Guard were about to make a comeback, they got kneecapped all over again. To Corax's credit, he didn't give up. Rather than wallow in defeat, like he does later after the Heresy's conclusion, he abandoned rebuilding his legion and returned to what he did best. Corax launched a brutal campaign of guerrilla warfare against the traitors. Small strike forces appeared seemingly out of nowhere, crippling supply lines, assassinating commanders, and tearing apart enemy infrastructure, before vanishing once more into the darkness. These operations may lack the spectacle of a grand campaign, but they continually bled the traitor war machine, and forced the traitors to divert resources to deal with threats far behind their lines. In the latter days of the Horus Hersey, Corax would be guided by visions, where he found the Space Wolves on the brink of destruction. Leading his legion to their safety, he would fight alongside the remaining Space Wolves, and successfully fight off the Sons of Horus led by Abaddon. Following the Battle of Urant, Corax would join Russ, and eventually reunite with Lionel Johnson on Deliverance. Although the Lion was openly critical of Corax's absence throughout the war, Russ would defend him, pointing to the simple fact that unlike many legions, the Raven Guard still existed because Corax had preserved them. Following this, when the Lion launched his crusade of vengeance, Corax refused to commit his entire legion to what he viewed as a largely emotional campaign. Damn, did you hear that, Dark Angels? Corvus Corax, the emo bird boy himself, thinks the Lion is emotional. Man, someone should look in the mirror. Instead, he assigned only a small contingent of his Raven Guard forces to this campaign. And although they were small in number, these warriors proved their value by eliminating critical targets ahead of the main advance. Unfortunately though, just like the other Primarchs, Leman, Russ, Lionel Johnson, and Gilliman, Corvus Corax did not make it to the Siege of Terra. And in fact, in the follow-up book, Ashes of the Imperium, he is still nowhere to be seen. Damn, the writers just forget about him every chance they get. He is truly too stealthy for his own good. So, when it comes to scoring Corvus Corax, I think a C grade is the fairest thing we can give him. Now, before the Raven Guard fans start loading their sniper rifles, let me explain myself first. The biggest thing working against Corax is that despite all of his efforts, he never really changes the course of the Heresy. Unlike Dorn, Sanguinius, Gilliman, Vulcan, or the Khan, Corvus Corax does not have a defining moment where his actions directly affect the fate of the Imperium. He spends most of the war reacting to the disaster of the Dropside Massacre, rather than shaping events on a galactic scale. To be fair though, that's not really his fault. Corvus Corax arguably started the Heresy in one of the worst positions of any Loyalist Primarch. Besides Vulcan, who lost his entire legion and then got tortured for months. But back to Corax, his legion was utterly annihilated at Isstvan V, forcing him to spend the remainder of the war fighting with a very small force. And to make matters worse, when he tried to rebuild his legion, the Alpha Legion sabotaged the genetic material needed to rapidly create new Marines. But at the same time, I don't think it's fair to give him a D or F grade, because while his legion was small in number, he still accomplished quite a bit. He nearly killed Lorgar at Isstvan V, conducted a highly successful guerrilla campaign against the traitors, repeatedly disrupted enemy operations, aided the Space Wolves at Urant, saving Leman Russ and his legion, or what remained of it, from destruction, and later contributed forces to the Lion's Crusade of Vengeance. So throughout the Heresy, the traitors were forced to account for the Raven Guard despite their shattered state. The issue is that none of these achievements were truly war-defining. Corax spent the Heresy, yes, inflicting cuts, but not delivering killing blows. His raids hurt the traitors, his operations bought time, and his legion remained active even after they were almost destroyed. But these actions are not equivalent to, say, the Khan banishing Mortarion, Vulcan protecting the Golden Throne, Guilliman gathering a relief force to break through the Iron Warriors' lines, or Dorn holding Terra together, or hell, even Sanguinius sacrificing himself to fight Horus. In many ways, Corax's greatest accomplishment is just simply not dying. So for me, Corvus Corax receives a C grade. So that's all of the Loyalist Primarchs. And before we get to naming an MVP, let's quickly run through the rankings one last time. Starting at the very bottom, we have Ferrus Manus in the fraud tier. Unfortunately for the Gorgon, there really isn't another way to score him. Ferrus ignored the advice of both Corax and Vulcan, charged headlong into Istvan 5, got himself killed almost immediately, removing himself and most of the Iron Hands from the war. Harsh? Probably. But when grading impact, Ferrus is unfortunately the definition of a fraud, especially with all those glazing statements that he's some genius general. Sorry Iron Hand fans, but I gotta bash your boy yet again. The Potential Man strikes yet again! Next on the grading scale is Corvus Corax, who received a C grade. Corax may have fought bravely, almost killed Lorgar, and conducted a highly effective guerrilla campaign against the traitors. The problem is, the stuff that he did do hardly altered the course of the conflict. Moving up, we have Leman Russ and Lionel Johnson receiving a B grade. Both Primarchs had moments of brilliance, but both also suffered major shortcomings. Russ removed Magnus from the board and nearly ended the war outright with his attack on Horus. But he also crippled his own legion and missed the siege entirely. The Lion, on the other hand, destroyed multiple traitor worlds, destroyed the Night Lords as a legion, and managed to capture Conrad Kurz. But he spent far too much of the Heresy away from the decisive theaters of war. Receiving an A grade, we have Jagatai Khan and Rabute Guilliman. Guilliman's achievements are quite obvious. He preserved Ultramar, assembled the largest Loyalist relief force, and was ultimately responsible for bringing the reinforcements that forced Horus into a desperate final gamble. The Khan, meanwhile, launched his own guerrilla campaign against the traitors, fought at the Siege of Terra, saving millions of civilian lives, secured the Lionsgate spaceport, and most of all, he banished Demon Primarch Mortarion. Both were absolutely instrumental in the Loyalist victory, but neither quite reaches the very top of my grading scale. Receiving an S grade and standing as the best of the Loyalist Primarchs, we have Rogal Dorn, Vulcan, and Sanguinius. Dorn was the wall upon which the entire Imperium rested. Without Dorn, Terra falls long before the Emperor ever boards the Vengeful Spirit. Every day the palace held was because Dorn made it hold. Vulcan endured torture, death, insanity, and impossible odds only to return to Terra and become one of the Emperor's most important defenders. He protected the throne, defeated Magnus not once but twice, and held on to hope even when the end seemed so near. And then there's Sanguinius, the Angel. The Primarch who inspired the Defenders, slew countless champions of chaos, defeated a demon Primarch himself, held the Eternity Gate, and ultimately fought Horus even though he knew the outcome was death. Which brings us to the final question. Who was the MVP of the Loyalist Primarchs? And I think there are only three real contenders: Rogal Dorn, Vulcan, and Sanguinius. So, which one of these three giant degen space babies deserves the crown as the Loyalist MVP of the Horus Hersey? And if we're being honest about impact, not flashy duels or individual hero moments, then Dorn is the clear MVP of the Loyalist side. Here's why, and I'm going to lay it out as plainly as possible. He is the reason Terra holds long enough for any other Primarch to matter. Without Dorn turning the Sol system into a layered fortress of attrition, the siege would have rapidly collapsed. He enables every other Loyalist major achievement, such as Sanguinius' sacrifice, Vulcan's protection of the throne, the Khan's counterattacks, Guilliman's eventual relief force. All of them wouldn't have existed without Terra standing as long as it did. Dorn held the entire might of the siege on his shoulders. He was the one coordinating the logistics, the planetary defenses, and the containment of catastrophic breaches across the entire palace. Sure, he was helped by aides and other Imperial generals, but for the most part, Dorn made the decisions that kept the traitors at bay and ensured Guilliman's relief force almost arrived in time. So when you weigh everything together, Dorn is the foundation of the entire Loyalist victory. And so, he is the MVP. That concludes this video. And yeah, it was kind of a long one, I'm gonna have to admit, but I had a little too much fun going through the Horus Hersey Black Books and ended up putting in way too many excerpts. Sorry guys, at the end of the day, I am just a simple autistic cow. Up next, we have the Traitor Primarchs, so stay tuned for that one, fellas. Finally, a huge shout out to my channel members. Luke Price, Anish Chatterjee, Caleb White, Dinkleberry, Musty, Impossy Paul, Ritter S, Morley Bankrupt, 1461, Jack Roar, Lag, Seth Capizilla, Tyler Pick 7, Keydree, and Simply Pain 66. You guys are the absolute bee's knees, and I hope you get a ton of milk in your system today and forever. I have a ton of fun power scaling videos coming up, like power scaling the Emperor in 40K. Which is going to be a very ambitious video, as I'm going to be covering all forms across the entirety of 40K. And that script is also incredibly freaking long, and absolutely packed to the brim with excerpts. So make sure you stick around for that one, fellas. As always, my beloved herd, stay milked, and I'll see you all real soon.